Imagine waking up one morning and your life is no longer yours. Not your work, not your body, not your family, not even your name. Everything that makes you a human being is controlled, sold, or violently destroyed by others. That's exactly what this script is about the history of slavery, about power, violence, profit, and the long struggle for freedom. But before we begin, I want to ask you a question. Why do you think people have been able to justify enslaving other people for thousands of years? Write your opinion in the comments below. Was it mainly greed, power, war, racism, religion, or the indifference of entire societies? If you find historical topics exciting and want to understand how past systems have shaped our world today, then subscribe to this channel. Also, give the video a like so that even more people engage with this important story. Because the history of slavery is not only a dark chapter of the past. It is a reminder of how fragile freedom can be and how dangerous it becomes when people deny other people their dignity. In this video, we travel from the early advanced civilizations to antiquity and the Middle Ages to the transatlantic slave trade, plantations, resistance, abolition, and modern forms of exploitation. We look not only at numbers, empires, and trade routes, but above all at the people whose lives have been shaped by this system, broken and yet never completely extinguished. Chapter 1. Origin of Bondage. The history of slavery does not begin with a single event, not with a specific kingdom, nor with a clear date to write in a chronicle. It begins where people became sedentary, accumulated property, social differences arose, and power was no longer exercised only for the moment, but could be organized permanently. As long as small groups of hunter-gatherers lived in mobile communities, it was difficult to keep people permanently as property. Those who were captured had to be guarded, fed, and controlled. In a world where food was uncertain and groups were constantly migrating, permanent enslavement was often impractical. This does not mean that violence, robbery, or imprisonment were unknown. But the conditions for a fixed system of bondage only emerged gradually, as societies became larger, richer, and more hierarchical. With sedentary life, man's relationship to his environment changed. Fields were cultivated, animals were kept, supplies were created, villages grew, and some villages became cities. Possessions took on a new meaning. Land, grain, livestock, tools, and houses could be passed down through generations. Those who had more could employ other people, make them dependent, or rule over them. Simple differences became social hierarchies. Some people had supplies, weapons, or religious authority. Others were dependent on protection, food, or work. In this world, a dangerous idea arose. People could not only provide labor, but could also be turned into property themselves. Lack of freedom took many forms. Not every unfree person was automatically a slave in the later sense. There was guilt dependence, prisoner of war, forced service, domestic servitude, serfdom, and other forms of personal dependence. Often these conditions were close to each other. Those who could not pay their debts may have lost their land, their freedom, or had to give their children to other people's households. Those who were defeated in war could be killed, expelled, plundered, or captured. Prisoners became workers, signs of victory, or objects of exchange. Slavery thus arose not only from economic calculation, but also from violence, war, fear, and the desire to make power visible. The war was particularly important. In early societies, war was not just fighting between armed men. It also meant plundering, deportation, and the destruction of social ties. Whoever defeated an opponent could rob his cattle, take his supplies, and take his people away. Captured women, men, and children were forced into the community of the victors, but usually not as equals. They were outside their own kinship order, no longer had any protection from their original group, and could therefore be controlled more easily. This was precisely a core of early slavery. The enslaved human being was torn out of his social context. He was not simply poor or subordinate, but uprooted. This uprooting made slavery so cruel. A person who lost his family, his language, his place, and his rights was more easily seen as a foreigner. Distance arose from this strangeness. Those who were considered foreigners were more likely to be treated as inferior. Many early societies justified the subjugation of other people by distinguishing between their own group and the others. One's own people were considered protected, connected by kinship or divinely ordered. The others could be labeled as enemies, barbarians, debtors, vanquished or dispossessed. Slavery was therefore never just an economic institution. It has always been an intellectual and social construction in which people persuade themselves that certain other people have less right to freedom. As cities grew, work became increasingly important. Large buildings, irrigation systems, temples, palaces, granaries, and fortifications demanded organized labor. Not all of this work was done by slaves. Many early states also used free farmers, forced labor, taxpayers, or paid workers. But wherever power was centralized, opportunities arose to force people to work. Rulers could give orders, officials could collect taxes, priests could establish religious duties, soldiers could use violence. The state thus became a machine that could order work, food, and people on a large scale. Forms of slavery also found their place in this order. A decisive factor was the emergence of law. As soon as societies laid down written rules, unfreedom also became legally describable. People could appear as property in deeds, debts could be recorded, buying and selling could be regulated. The law did not necessarily create slavery, but it stabilized it. What had previously been based on violence or tradition was now managed, inherited, and protected. In the eyes of an authority, a person could become a thing that someone else was allowed to dispose of. This legal transformation was a deep turning point, because it made bondage not only possible, but seemingly normal. Early slavery should not always be thought of as a uniform system. In some societies, slaves worked in households, in fields, in workshops, or in palaces. Some could own property, marry, or be freed. Others were subjected to extremely brutal conditions, especially in mines, quarries, or during heavy agricultural work. The degree of violence varied, but the basic idea remained the same. One person was under the control of another. His freedom did not depend on his own will, but on the will of the owner, the state, or the ruling order. Slavery also developed out of economic constraints. When labor was scarce, prisoners could become valuable. When land was available but too few people were cultivating it, the benefits of forced labor increased. When elites sought luxury goods, construction projects, or military strength, they needed people to carry the burdens. Slavery was thus linked to the rise of complex societies. It was a means of increasing wealth, securing rule, and consolidating social inequality. At the same time, it was always risky. Those who oppress people must expect flight, resistance, sabotage, or uprisings. Therefore, surveillance, punishments, and ideologies arose that were supposed to secure this rule. The origins of slavery show that lack of freedom did not simply arise from cruelty alone. It arose from a mixture of violence, ownership, social inequality, war, debt, religious interpretations, and political organization. People made other people unfree because they benefited from it and because their societies found ways to justify this violence. This is precisely what makes the story so frightening. Slavery was not only a crime committed by brutal individuals. It was supported by entire orders, by markets, laws, habits, and worldviews. But from the beginning, there was also another side. Where people were made unfree, there was a desire for freedom. Where families were separated, there was remembrance. Where there was violence, there was resistance. Some tried to flee, others refused work, kept their language, their songs, their rituals, or their dignity hidden. Even though early sources were often written from the point of view of the rulers, one must not forget that behind every term such as slave, prisoner, or servant there was a human being. A person with fear, hope, pain, memories, and a life of his own. The origin of the lack of freedom is therefore more than a historical starting point. It shows how early people began to institutionalize power over others, but also how artificial any justification of this power was. No man was born as a possession. No order, no law, and no war could really abolish the fact that the enslaved remained a human being. It is precisely in this contradiction that lies the core of the entire history of slavery. Societies could humiliate, sell, and disenfranchise people, but they could never completely extinguish their humanity. Chapter 2. Slavery in the Early Advanced Civilizations. As villages became cities and local communities became early states, the form of human dependence also changed. In the first advanced civilizations, slavery was not always the dominant foundation of the entire economy, but it was an integral part of social order, political power, and economic exploitation. Mesopotamia, Egypt, ancient India, and China show in different ways how early societies placed people in hierarchies, how they organized work, and how they justified lack of freedom. Slavery was not the same everywhere. It could arise from war, from debt, from punishment, from birth, or from trade. It could be hard and visible, but it could also be hidden in domestic dependencies. It is precisely this diversity that makes it clear that slavery was not a single system, but a recurring response of powerful societies to questions of labor, property, domination, and control. In Mesopotamia, the land between the Euphrates and the Tigris, some of the earliest known cities in human history were built. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Babylon were centers of administration, temples, trade, and agriculture. Here, fields were irrigated, grain was stored, taxes were collected, and workers were organized. The temples and palaces played a central role in this. They were not only religious places, but also economic institutions. They owned land, livestock, supplies, and people who worked for them. In addition to free farmers, craftsmen, and dependent workers, there were also slaves. They could be brought to the cities as prisoners of war, arise from debt relationships, or be sold as property. In cuneiform sources, they often appear soberly as part of contracts, inventories, or legal cases. It is precisely this sober language that shows how naturally lack of freedom was built into the administrative apparatus. The famous Codex Hammurabi from the 18th century BC makes it clear that slavery was firmly anchored in Babylonian law. He distinguished between free people, dependent persons, and slaves. Slaves had different rights and different punishments than free citizens. Anyone who helped a slave escape or hid him could be severely punished. At the same time, such laws show that slavery had to be constantly secured. A system that has to prevent escape also proves that lack of freedom has never simply been accepted. Slaves were people with a will of their own, with relationships and hopes. The law tried to make them property, but it is precisely the existence of rules against flight, sale, or unlawful appropriation that shows that this order was repeatedly threatened. Debt slavery also played an important role in Mesopotamia. Those who could not pay their debts could temporarily make themselves or family members dependent. This did not always mean lifelong slavery, but it showed the hard link between business and freedom. Poverty could lead to lack of freedom. Crop failures, tax burdens, wars, or personal hardship could turn free people into dependent workers. Thus, slavery was not only created by external violence, but also by social inequality within a society. The early states were able to produce wealth, but that wealth was unevenly distributed. Whoever was at the top benefited from supplies, land, and trade. Those who stood at the bottom could lose their freedom due to debt, dependence, and lack of protection. In ancient Egypt, the situation was different and at the same time similar. Egyptian society was strongly hierarchical. At the top was the pharaoh, who was understood not only as a ruler, but also as a divinely legitimized figure of order. Under him stood officials, priests, scribes, soldiers, craftsmen, peasants, and dependent workers. For a long time, it was assumed in the imagination of many people that the Great Pyramids were built primarily by slave labor. Today, researchers take a more differentiated view. Many large construction projects were probably supported by organized labor services of free or semi-free workers who were supplied by the state. Nevertheless, slavery and other forms of forced dependence also existed in Egypt. Prisoners of war from Nubia, Libya, or the Near East in particular could be deported to Egypt and used in households, temples, palaces, or on agricultural estates. Egyptian slavery was closely linked to conquest and statehood. When pharaohs led campaigns, they returned not only with booty, gold, and prestige, but also with people. These prisoners were signs of royal power. They proved that Pharaoh had subjugated foreign peoples and that the Egyptian order triumphed over the chaos of the outside world. In temple inscriptions, defeated enemies were often depicted as a mass, not as individuals. This marked the beginning of a dehumanization that combined political propaganda and economic benefits. People became prey, and booty became work, status, and religious sacrifice to the order of the empire. At the same time, Egyptian society cannot be explained by slavery alone. Most of the agricultural work was done by farmers who were bound by village communities, taxes, and state obligations. But even these people were not completely free in the modern sense. They had to pay taxes, fulfill work duties, and were integrated into a system controlled by officials. This shows an important point for the history of unfreedom. There are many intermediate stages between freedom and slavery. A farmer could not legally be a slave and still live a strongly bonded life. A prisoner of war could be the property of a temple and still have certain tasks, relationships, and limited scope of action within a household. Early advanced civilizations did not simply classify people into free and unfree. They created whole gradations of dependence. In ancient India, we also encounter complex forms of social subordination. The Vedic and later Indian society developed distinct hierarchies that were linked to origin, profession, religion, and social duty. The term dasa could have different meanings in early texts, including enemy, servant, or unfree. Later, legal and religious writings contain references to people who were considered slaves or servants. Slavery could arise from birth, purchase, war, punishment, or necessity. At the same time, social inequality has been deeply embedded in the worldview through religious and cultural ideas. Not every low position was slavery, but the idea that people had different duties and ranks from birth could stabilize forms of subordination. In India, it is particularly important that lack of freedom was thought of not only economically, but also ritually and socially. Those born in a low social position could be excluded from education, power, property, and religious standing. Slavery in the narrower sense was only one part of a larger world of dependencies. Households, farms, agricultural goods, and political systems of rule used people whose options for action were limited. Here, too, moral tensions arose. Religious teachings could emphasize compassion, duty, and order, but at the same time justify existing hierarchies. As in other early cultures, the crucial question was not only whether people were not free, but why a society considered this lack of freedom to be legitimate. There were also forms of slavery in ancient China, especially in early dynasties such as the Shang and Zhou periods. Prisoners of war could be enslaved, used for work, or sacrificed in ritual contexts. In the earliest Chinese states, military power, ancestor worship, agriculture, and rule were combined. People from subjugated groups could be forced into the service of noble families or rulers. Later, slavery never became equally important in every era, but it remained an institution. People could become slavishly dependent through punishment, debts, poverty, or birth. Elite households used servants, palaces had dependent labor, and the state was able to mobilize forced labor for large projects. China in particular shows how closely slavery and state forced labor could coexist. Large walls, canals, palace complexes, streets, and tombs demanded enormous amounts of work. Not all workers were slaves. Many were farmers, convicts, or people who owed the state labor services. But from the point of view of those affected, the boundary between compulsory service and coercion could almost become blurred. Those who were caught by civil servants, sent to distant construction sites, and forced to work under strict supervision experienced the state as direct power over their own bodies. Here, too, it becomes apparent that early advanced civilizations were not only characterized by their writing, art and architecture, but also by the ability to control people on a large scale. In all early advanced civilizations, slavery was therefore part of a broader order. It stood alongside other forms of dependence and was supported by law, war, religion, property, and administration. It was not always the most important form of work, but it was a clear sign of how far power over people could reach. The slave was a worker, booty, status symbol, household member, commodity, or punishment. Depending on the place and time, his life could look different, but his basic situation remained marked by heteronomy. The early advanced civilizations fascinate us to this day with their temples, cities, writings, laws, and works of art. But behind these achievements were not only clever rulers, talented builders, and religious visions. Behind them were also people whose work was forced, whose names are often not handed down, and whose voices can hardly be heard in the sources. Therefore, when we tell the story of these cultures, we must see both their creative power and their hardness, their ability to create order and their willingness to subject people to this order. Slavery in the early advanced civilizations was not a marginal phenomenon of a primitive past. It was part of the emergence of organized power. Where administration, law, and wealth grew, the possibility of making people systematically dependent also grew. But precisely because these societies wrote laws, conducted treaties, and established rule, it becomes apparent that slavery was always a conscious order. It was not based on nature, but on decisions, interests, and power relations. And this is the beginning of one of the central insights of the entire history of slavery. The higher a civilization developed its order, the greater its responsibility for the people it disenfranchised in this order. Chapter 3. Antiquity and the Normalization of Slavery. In antiquity, slavery was not regarded as an exception in many societies, but as a natural part of the order. This is one of the most frightening points of this story. People could think about philosophy, law, art, democracy, the art of war and governance, and at the same time accept that other people were bought, sold, inherited, and forced to work. Ancient Greece and the Roman Empire in particular show how deeply slavery had penetrated the economy, everyday life, politics, and thought. It was not only a brutal marginal phenomenon, but a cornerstone of many areas of life. Without slave labor, some forms of prosperity, leisure, and political participation of free citizens would hardly have been conceivable. In ancient Greece, slavery was widespread. It existed in city-states such as Athens, Corinth, Sparta, and many other regions, but in different forms. In Athens, often referred to as the birthplace of democracy, numerous slaves lived in households, workshops, mines, and public services. This contradiction is particularly striking. A society could allow its free male citizens to have a say in politics, and at the same time completely exclude large groups of people from freedom and rights. Athenian democracy was based on a narrow concept of citizenship. Above all, adult male citizens with corresponding ancestry were allowed to participate. Women, strangers, propertyless people without citizenship, and slaves stood outside this political community. Freedom was therefore not a general human right, but a privilege of a limited group. Slaves in Athens could have very different tasks. Some worked as domestic servants, cooks, nurses, educators, or craftsmen. Others were used in workshops, for example in metalworking, ceramics production, or trade. The working conditions in the silver mines of Laurion were particularly cruel, where many slaves had to work under dangerous and unhealthy conditions. These mines were economically significant, as silver strengthened Athenian power, financed naval construction and trade, and contributed to Athens' political weight. Here it becomes clear how closely slavery was linked to military and economic strength. Athens' brilliant achievements also stood on the backs of people whose suffering often disappears in the great political narratives. The origin of the slaves varied. Many were prisoners of war, others were brought into slavery through piracy, human trafficking, or birth. In the markets of the Greek world, people from Thrace, Asia Minor, Syria, the Black Sea region, and other areas were sold. Foreignness played an important role in this. Those who did not belong to their own community, who spoke a different language or came from a defeated region could be dehumanized more easily. The Greeks often referred to non-Greeks as barbarians. This term did not always automatically mean inferior in the modern racist sense, but it created a clear cultural boundary. One's own world was considered orderly, civilized, and politically superior, while strangers were more easily regarded as people who could be disposed of. Philosophers and writers of antiquity dealt with slavery, but only a few questioned it fundamentally. Aristotle developed the idea that there are people who are naturally destined to serve. This idea was not simply a personal opinion, but an expression of a society that wanted to explain and justify its existing order. If slavery was considered natural, it no longer had to be recognized as violence. This is precisely where the power of such ideas lies. They transform a relationship of domination into a seemingly rational order. Of course, there are also doubts, contradictions, and individual voices that emphasize that slaves were human beings and became unfree by circumstances, not by their nature. But the ancient world did not develop a broad movement to abolish slavery. Economic interests, habits, and social dependencies were too strong. In Sparta, bondage took on a special form. There, the helots were at the center of the system. They were not slaves in the classic private sense, but a subjugated population group that was tied to the land and worked for the Spartan full citizens. The Messenian helots in particular were the result of military conquest. Their work enabled the Spartan citizens to concentrate entirely on war training, discipline, and military lifestyle. Sparta was thus a state whose famous military order was based on the subjugation of a large dependent population. The fear of uprisings deeply shaped Spartan politics. The helots were monitored, humiliated, and forcibly controlled. Here it becomes particularly clear that a system of bondage shapes not only the oppressed, but also the oppressors. A society that constantly fears an uprising becomes hard, distrustful, and ready to use violence. Slavery also reached enormous importance in the Roman Empire. Rome was first a city, then a republic, and finally an empire. With each expansion, the number of prisoners of war brought to Italy and other Roman territories grew. Roman victories meant not only fame, land, and booty, but also people. After successful campaigns, thousands were enslaved. These people were sold in markets, employed on estates, brought into households, made craftsmen, sent to mines, or used for public works. The Roman economy, especially in the late Republic, was strongly influenced by slave labor in some areas. On the large estates, the so-called latifundia, many slaves worked in agriculture. They produced wine, oil, grain, and other goods for markets and cities. This changed the social structure of Italy. Small farmers, who had long been considered the backbone of the Roman Republic, came under pressure. Many could not compete with the large estates of the rich elites, lost land, or migrated to the cities. Slavery was thus associated with a deep social crisis. Roman expansion brought wealth to senators, generals, and entrepreneurs, but it also exacerbated inequality and political tensions. Slavery was not only an economic tool, but part of a power structure that changed the republic internally. Slaves were omnipresent in everyday life in Rome. Wealthy families had servants, teachers, scribes, doctors, cooks, hairdressers, porters, and administrators. Some slaves had demanding tasks and were able to have close contact with their owners. Some were released and were able to lead a limited but often economically active life as freedmen. But these examples must not be romanticized. Even an educated house slave remained legally unfree. His body, his work, and his future did not belong to himself. For many others, life was even more brutal. In mines, quarries, galleys, or on remote estates, the conditions were often deadly. The range of experiences was wide, but the basis remained violence. Roman law made slavery a clear legal category. Slaves were considered property. They could be sold, inherited, punished, and released. At the same time, Roman society recognized in everyday life that slaves were people with skills, relationships, and responsibilities. This contradiction was typical of many slave societies. They needed the intelligence, work, and loyalty of the enslaved, but did not want to grant them full humanity in the legal sense. A slave could raise a child, run a business, provide medical treatment, or manage a house, but still remain subject to the will of his owner. This split between practical recognition and legal dehumanization was a core of Roman slavery. Resistance was therefore inevitable. Enslaved people could work slowly, damage tools, flee, ally, or openly rebel. The most famous slave revolts in Rome, especially the revolt of Spartacus in the 1st century BC, showed the fear that lay hidden at the heart of the Roman order. Spartacus and his companions were not only a military threat, but a symbol of the fragility of a system that subjugated millions of people. Rome reacted with extreme severity, because a successful slave revolt would have called the basic order into question. The brutal suppression of such revolts was intended to deter and make the power of the masters visible again. The normalization of slavery in Antiquity was based on several factors. War provided people. They distributed markets. She ordered the law. Philosophy and custom justified it. Economic benefits made them attractive. Political orders benefited from it. And the social distance between free citizens and the enslaved ensured that many people did not perceive suffering as a moral problem in their own right. It is precisely this normality that makes ancient slavery so important for understanding history. It shows that injustice does not always appear as an exception. Sometimes it dresses up in laws, traditions, and everyday habits. But despite all the justifications, slavery remained a relationship of violence. No philosophical proposition, no law, and no economic benefit could change this. Ancient societies could convince themselves that slavery was natural, necessary, or beneficial. But they had to guard, punish, sell, control, and prevent slaves from escaping. This alone shows that the order was never really natural. It had to be produced constantly. Behind the great narratives of democracy, republic, empire, philosophy, and civilization stood people whose freedom was robbed. Anyone who wants to understand Antiquity must therefore see both its impressive cultural achievements and the price that others paid for them. Chapter 4. Rome as a slave state. Rome was not from the beginning a slave state to the enormous extent that would later shape the Roman world. In the early Republic, many Romans still lived in comparatively manageable social structures. Peasants tilled their land, family associations determined daily life, and political power lay with a small citizenry that was still strongly tied to military duty and land ownership. But with every conquest, with every victory, and with every new province, Roman society changed. A city on the Tiber became a power that dominated Italy, then subjugated the Mediterranean, and finally built an empire whose wealth, administration, and way of life were largely based on the work of unfree people. Roman slavery became a system that combined war, economy, law, everyday life, and political power. The most important driver of this development was the war. Roman expansion brought not only land, gold, grain, and prestige, but also people. When Roman legions conquered a city, defeated a tribe, or crushed an uprising, the survivors could be enslaved in large numbers. For Rome, prisoners were part of the booty. Commanders could use them to reward their soldiers, merchants could sell them at markets, and wealthy Romans could buy them as workers. Especially after great campaigns, huge numbers of slaves poured into Italy. The wars against Carthage, the conquests in Greece, Asia Minor, Gaul, and the eastern Mediterranean led to more and more people being torn from their homeland and deported to the Roman world. Thus, slavery was not only a social institution, but a direct consequence of imperial violence. Roman society became accustomed to this constant availability of human labor. Slaves were traded in markets like commodities, but they were not inanimate things. They came from different regions, spoke different languages, had professions, memories, families, and hopes. On the market, however, they were valued according to age, strength, health, beauty, education, or special ability. A strong man could be sold for field work or heavy physical labor, an educated person as a teacher, clerk, or administrator, a young woman as a domestic servant, nurse, or object of sexual exploitation. The market reduced people to utility. This was precisely one of the most brutal aspects of Roman slavery. It turned biographies into prizes. In Italy, especially in the late Republic, large estates, the so-called latifundia, were built. They belonged to rich senators, knights, and other members of the upper class. Slaves worked on these estates in agriculture, animal husbandry, viticulture, and the production of olive oil. Some estates were run strictly economically, almost like companies. The owner often lived in Rome or in a villa, while administrators organized the work. The slaves there were subject to a harsh discipline. They had to work long hours, were monitored, punished, and sometimes kept in chains. Especially on remote estates, the risk of mistreatment was great, because the owner or administrator had almost unlimited power over them. The wealth of the Roman elite was therefore based not only on clever administration or successful politics, but on the systematic exploitation of human bodies. This development had profound consequences for the Roman Republic. Many free small farmers came under pressure. For a long time they had formed the backbone of the Roman army, for the burgess peasant was at the same time a soldier. But when farmers served in the war for years, their fields could be neglected. When they returned in debt or lost their land, rich landowners bought up their land. The large estates worked with slaves and could produce more cheaply than small family farms. This created a dangerous cycle. Expansion brought slaves and wealth for the upper class. This wealth displaced free peasants, and social inequality grew. Slavery was thus not only a moral problem, but also a political explosive. It changed the balance of power inside Rome. Slaves were also omnipresent in the cities. In Rome itself, they lived in rich households, workshops, baths, shops, kitchens, and administrative areas. Some worked as simple servants, porters, cooks, or cleaners. Others were highly specialized specialists. There were Greek teachers, doctors, secretaries, librarians, musicians, actors, accountants, and administrators. Wealthy Romans used slaves not only for work, but also to represent their social rank. Those who owned many slaves showed wealth and influence. A large household was a visible sign of social position. Slavery was therefore deeply embedded in the culture of the Roman elite. It organized comfort, education, luxury, and public recognition. But the apparent closeness in the household did not mean equality. A house slave could meet the owner on a daily basis, raise his children, run his business, or know his personal secrets. Nevertheless, it remained legally the property. He could be punished, sold, or separated from his family. Slaves were particularly vulnerable, who were often also exposed to sexual violence. In Roman households, work, dependence, and personal availability were closely related. The lord's power reached into areas that modern societies would consider intimate and inviolable. Especially in the household, it became clear how deeply slavery penetrated private life. Roman law made this order formally possible. A slave was legally considered a thing, the property of a master. He could not have his own full legal status, could not freely decide on his life, and was subject to the will of the owner. At the same time, the reality was more contradictory. Some slaves were able to manage money, conduct business, or own a so-called peculium, i.e. a special fund that was left to them to use. Some were able to buy their way out with the consent of their owner or were released as a reward. Freedmen could be economically successful in Roman society, but often remained bound to their former master by duties. This possibility of release made the system more flexible, but not fairer. It gave hope to individuals, but at the same time stabilized slavery because it could reward obedience and loyalty. Life was hardest for those who were employed in mines, quarries, mills, or in extremely heavy agricultural work. In the mines of Hispania or other provinces, the work was life-threatening. Dust, darkness, bad air, collapses, exhaustion, and violence determined everyday life. Those who ended up there often had little prospect of a long life. Mill work could also be cruel because people were used like animals. Such places show the naked brutality of the system. While educated domestic slaves had room for maneuver in some cases, others were downright consumed. The value of their lives was measured by their labor power. A special chapter of Roman slavery were the gladiators. Not all gladiators were slaves, but many came from slavery, prisoner of war or criminal conviction. They were trained in schools and had to fight in arenas, often for the entertainment of the crowd and for the self-promotion of political elites. Gladiator games were more than brutal spectacles. They showed Roman power over life and death. The audience saw courage, violence, discipline, and submission as a public spectacle. For the fighters themselves, the arena meant a mixture of coercion, danger of death, and rare opportunity for glory. Some became famous, some were able to gain freedom, but the basis remained an order in which human life became an event for others. Where oppression was so comprehensive, resistance arose. Many slaves fled, sabotaged work, feigned illness, stole, organized secret networks, or tried to buy their way out. Sometimes resistance broke out openly. The great slave revolts of the Roman Republic, especially in Sicily and later the revolt of Spartacus, shook the Roman world. Spartacus was a Thracian gladiator who fled with others from a gladiator school in Capua in 73 BC. An escape turned into a huge movement of armed slaves, uprooted and desperate. They defeated Roman troops several times and marched through Italy. For Rome, this was a frightening idea. People who were considered property acted as a military power. The uprising of Spartacus was not an orderly political program in the modern sense, but it was a fundamental challenge. He showed that the enslaved people were not broken inside. They could fight, plan, lead, and hope. Rome finally reacted with massive violence. Marcus Licinius Crassus crushed the uprising, and thousands of prisoners were crucified along the Appian Way. This public cruelty should send a message. It was intended to show that Rome had restored control over the enslaved. But it is precisely the severity of this punishment that betrays the fear of the gentleman. A system that has to deter so cruelly knows about its own fragility. Rome was a slave state not only because there were many slaves, but because slavery intervened in almost all areas of life. It shaped agriculture, household, mining, trade, education, entertainment, politics, and law. It made wealth possible, increased inequality, and changed the republic from within. It gave power and comfort to the elite, but cost countless people freedom, family, and lives. Roman civilization produced impressive roads, aqueducts, laws, literature, and administration. But these achievements stood alongside an order that made people property. The example of Rome shows particularly clearly how dangerous it is when injustice becomes a habit. Many Romans did not see slavery as a moral scandal, but as a normal part of their world. Rather, they asked how to manage slaves effectively, not whether humans would be allowed to own it all. And yet, under the surface, the contradiction always remained. A human being could be legally declared a thing, but he remained a human being. He could be sold, but he could remember. He could be punished, but he could resist. It is precisely this contradiction that accompanied Rome until the end of its history and makes Roman slavery one of the most striking examples of how power can shape an entire society and make it morally blind. Chapter 5. Slavery, Religion, and Morality. Slavery was never just an economic or political institution. It has always been a moral challenge. Any society that enslaved people had to explain somehow why one person was allowed to dispose of another. This explanation could come from law, from war, from custom, from the alleged inferiority of strangers, or from economic necessity. However, it was particularly effective where religion came into play. Religions gave people meaning, order, comfort, and rules. They explained the world, determined duties, talked about good and evil, and connected human life with divine authority. This is precisely why their role in the history of slavery was so significant and so contradictory. Religion was able to limit, mitigate, and later question slavery. but it could also justify, stabilize, or cover up existing power relations with sacred language. In many early cultures, the boundary between political order and religious order was almost inseparable. Rulers ruled not only with weapons, but also with divine legitimacy. Temples had land, supplies, flocks, and people. Priests administered manpower, offerings, and dues. In such societies, lack of freedom could appear as part of a cosmic order. Whoever stood at the top was considered appointed by the gods. Those who were at the bottom were to serve, obey, and fulfill their role. This idea made social differences not only practical, but seemingly natural and sacred. When an order appeared to be divinely willed, resistance to it was more easily portrayed as disobedience to the world itself. But religion was never just a language of domination. It also contained ideas of mercy, justice, responsibility, and protection of the weak. This is exactly what gave rise to a constant contradiction. On the one hand, many religious traditions accepted the existence of slavery as a given part of their world. On the other hand, they developed rules that were intended to limit abuse, allow for release, or recognize the moral value of the enslaved person. This contradiction runs through many centuries. Religions could not immediately abolish the system, but at the same time they reminded us that even the unfree was not simply a thing before God, the gods, or within a moral order. In Judaism, slavery appears in the biblical texts as a reality of the society of the time. The Hebrew Bible recognizes forms of debt slavery, prisoner of war, and home dependency. At the same time, there are rules that should set certain limits. Israelite debt slaves were not to be held indefinitely, and there were notions of rest, protection, and release. The memory of the Exodus from Egypt is particularly significant. The central basic experience of the people of Israel is liberation from bondage. This memory made the experience of bondage a moral standard. Those who had experienced servitude themselves should not forget the stranger, the poor, and the dependent. Nevertheless, slavery did not disappear as a result. The biblical idea of liberation stood next to a social reality in which unfree labor continued to exist. It was precisely this tension that made later interpretations so important. In Christianity, this tension continued. The first Christian communities emerged within the Roman Empire, in a world where slavery was commonplace. Many early Christians were poor, some were slaves, others belonged to households or urban communities where slavery was a matter of course. Christianity proclaimed that all people have a value before God, and that social differences are not decisive with regard to salvation. The idea that slaves and freemen could be spiritually equal was quite significant in an ancient society. It morally lifted the enslaved human being out of the mere thing. Nevertheless, the early church did not call for a general abolition of slavery. Instead, early Christian texts admonish slaves to obey and masters to be mild. From today's perspective, this finding is difficult to bear. Why did a religion that emphasized charity, mercy, and human dignity not immediately question slavery in principle? Part of the answer lies in the historical conditions. The early Christians initially had no political power, lived within existing Roman structures, and often expected a spiritual change rather than a social revolution. But this does not solve the moral problem. Because when Christianity later became more powerful and finally rose to become the defining religion of the Roman Empire in Europe, slavery continued to exist in various forms. Christian societies could keep slaves, enslave prisoners of war, engage in human trafficking, and later even justify the transatlantic slave trade. They did this despite a message that actually contained universal charity. In the Middle Ages, the forms of lack of freedom in Europe changed. Classical ancient slavery declined in many regions, while serfdom, and other dependencies became more important. But the slave trade did not disappear. In the Mediterranean region, on the borders between Christian and Muslim dominions, and in Eastern Europe, people continued to be stolen, sold, and abducted. Religion could fulfill a double function. On the one hand, it became increasingly problematic to enslave fellow believers. On the other hand, People of other faiths could more easily be considered legitimate prey. Christians enslaved Muslims, Muslims enslaved Christians, and both sides found religious or legal arguments to justify each other's lack of freedom. The difference of faith became a moral boundary. Those who stood outside their own religious community could be disenfranchised more easily. Slavery was also a historical reality in Islam. The Quran and the Islamic legal development originated in a society in which slavery already existed. Islamic teachings did not prohibit slavery in principle, but opposed it with rules and moral obligations. The emancipation of slaves was considered a meritorious act, such as atonement or an expression of religious piety. Slaves were to be cared for, and there were legal regulations on marriage, property, concubinage, release, and treatment. At the same time, slavery remained deeply rooted in Islamic empires for many centuries. People were abducted or trafficked from Africa, Central Asia, the Caucasus, Europe, and other regions. They worked in households, in armies, in administrations, in fields or on farms. Some were able to reach high positions, such as military slaves in certain Islamic empires, but even this did not change the fact that their original situation was based on the deprivation of personal freedom. The phenomenon of military slaves is particularly interesting. In various Islamic empires, young men were bought as slaves, trained and used as soldiers. The Mamluks in Egypt or other military slave systems show how complex slavery could be. Some of these men became elite soldiers, commanders, or even rulers. At first glance, this seems to contradict the usual idea of slavery. But it does not show that slavery was harmless, but how flexibly systems of rule could deal with lack of freedom. A person could start out legally unfree and still gain military power. It remained part of an order in which origin, uprooting, and education were deliberately used to create loyalty to the ruler rather than to family or tribe. Religion could thus not only justify slavery, but also make it politically useful. If a war was understood as a holy or just war, prisoners could more easily be considered rightful booty. When people of other faiths were seen as outside their own order, the moral inhibition threshold was lowered. If one's own community appeared to be the bearer of a higher truth, the submission of others could be interpreted as punishment, mission, or divine providence. Such interpretations were dangerous because they morally enhanced violence. Robbery became alleged order. Exploitation became an alleged duty. Domination became alleged divine will. At the same time, religious traditions later developed into strong criticism of slavery. Especially in modern times, Christian groups such as Quakers and evangelical abolitionists played an important role in the fight against the slave trade. They argued that no person should be considered the property of another before God. They referred to conscience, charity, equality of souls, and moral responsibility. There were also voices within Islamic, Jewish, and other traditions of thought urging mercy, release, and the limitation of violence. But this criticism often prevailed late and had to fight against powerful economic interests. Religion was therefore not automatically liberation and not automatically oppression. It was a field of struggle. The crucial point is that religion does not absolve man of his moral responsibility. Anyone who uses sacred texts, traditions, or authorities to justify lack of freedom is nevertheless making a decision. History shows that the same religious terms could be interpreted differently. One could emphasize order or mercy, obedience or liberation, difference between groups or common humanity. This is precisely why the role of religion in the history of slavery is so contradictory. It shows not only what people believed, but also what they used their faith for. Slavery posed a simple but uncomfortable question to every religion. Is the enslaved human being in his innermost worth just as human as the free man? As long as societies did not answer this question with a clear yes, they could find ways to tolerate exploitation. You could say that the world is just like that. They could say that a good master is better than a cruel master. They could say slavery was allowed as long as certain rules were followed. But all these answers remained incomplete because they did not eliminate the basic force. A person whose freedom depends on the will of another does not live in true justice. In the end, this chapter shows that the history of slavery is also a history of conscience. Religions gave people words of compassion and dignity, but they were also often used to protect power. They could loosen chains and bless chains at the same time. They could give hope and cover up injustice. Precisely for this reason, one must look at their role soberly. Not every pious language was just. Not every legal limitation was liberation. And not every moral teaching was also lived morally. The history of slavery reminds us that a person's worth must not depend on what community he belongs to, what faith he has, what war he has lost, or what benefit others derive from him. Where religion defended this idea, it could become the force of liberation. Where she betrayed him, she became part of the oppression. Chapter 6. Slavery in the Middle Ages. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, slavery did not simply disappear from Europe and the wider Mediterranean world. She only changed her shape. The ancient world, with its large Roman estates, urban households, mines and markets, slowly transitioned into new political orders. Germanic kingdoms, Byzantine administration, Islamic caliphates, Christian principalities, monasteries, trading cities and local rulers formed a new world in which freedom and lack of freedom remained closely intertwined. The Middle Ages were therefore not a time when slavery simply ended. Rather, numerous intermediate forms of dependency, servitude, serfdom, and personal bondage emerged. Some people were legally slaves, others were tied to land, had to do forced labor, pay taxes, or were under the power of a landlord. The boundaries between these forms were often fluid, and this is precisely where the particular difficulty of this epoch lies. In the early Middle Ages, many people lived in rural structures. Cities shrank in parts of Western Europe, long-distance trade became more uncertain, political power was distributed among kings, nobles, bishops, and local lords. Work was mainly tied to land. Those who had land at their disposal had food, shelter, taxes, and people. In this world, classical Roman slavery slowly lost importance in many regions, while other forms of dependence increased. Slaves could become serfs, free peasants could become dependent peasants, and personal employment relationships gave rise to permanent ties to land and rule. That didn't mean that life automatically got better. A serf or serf, peasant may not have been property in the same sense as an ancient slave, but his freedom of movement, economic opportunities, and rights were severely restricted. Serfdom became a formative form of medieval bondage. A serf was usually bound to a certain estate or a landlord. He was often not allowed to leave without permission, had to pay taxes, perform forced labor, and could be dependent on his master's approval in many areas of life. Marriage, inheritance, use of mills, forests, or pastures, even the change of residence could be controlled. In return, the landlord offered protection, access to land, and a certain integration into a social order. But this protection was not an equal treaty. It was based on power. The serf lived in a system that permanently tied his workforce, his time, and often also his family to a rule. The difference between slavery and serfdom was nevertheless important. The slave could be sold as a person, while the serf was in many cases more connected to the land. He often had his own house, a family, rights to use fields, and a place in the village community. He was able to receive religious sacraments, appear in local courts, and shape his own life in certain areas. But these limited rights must not hide the fact that he remained unfree. Freedom in the Middle Ages did not mean the same as in modern societies. Many people lived in bonds, duties, and dependencies. The question was not only whether someone was free or unfree, but how strongly his person, his work, and his future were controlled by others. While in Western Europe many forms of ancient slavery gradually turned into serfdom and serfdom, the slave trade remained alive in other regions. The Mediterranean region in particular was a space of constant encounter, violence, and abduction. Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived, traded, and fought with each other. Wars, piracy, and border conflicts led to people being captured and sold. In North Africa, Italy, Spain, Byzantium, the Balkans, the Black Sea and the Middle East, there were markets where people were traded. The term slave itself is linguistically related to the Slavs, because in the early and high Middle Ages many people from Slavic areas were sold into slavery. This shows how closely ethnic, religious, and political boundaries were linked to human trafficking. Venice, Genoa, and other trading centers in particular later played an important role in these networks. They connected Europe with Byzantium, the Islamic Mediterranean, and the Black Sea. People from Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, Central Asia, or the border regions between the Christian and Muslim worlds could be sold into households, farms, or military services. In some cases, young women were treated as domestic servants or concubines, young men as workers, soldiers, or court servants. Such trade routes show that the Middle Ages were by no means a closed world of local villages. It was also a world of markets, ships, ports, and chains of violence in which people were abducted over long distances. Religion played an ambivalent role in this. Within Christian societies, it became more problematic over time to keep other Christians as slaves. Common baptism created a moral boundary. But this limit did not apply to all people. Pagans, Muslims, Jews, or people from foreign regions could continue to be regarded as legitimate prisoners or commodities. The same was true in Islamic societies, where the enslavement of Muslims was restricted, while non-Muslims could be enslaved from wars or trade networks. Thus, religion became a line that protected one's own community and excluded others. Those who stood outside their own religious order were more at risk of being deprived of their freedom. The Byzantine Empire preserved many elements of Roman law and administrative tradition. There, too, slavery continued to exist, albeit in modified forms. In Byzantine households, on estates, and in state structures, slaves or dependent workers could be used. At the same time, a complex system of peasant dependencies and tax obligations developed. Byzantium was a bridge between Antiquity and the Middle Ages, between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. His story shows that slavery did not suddenly disappear with the end of the Western Roman Empire, but lived on in various legal forms and social practices. In the Islamic Middle Ages, slavery was also widespread and diverse. The great caliphates and later sultanates connected vast areas from Spain and North Africa to Persia, Central Asia, and India. Through trade routes through the Sahara, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, enslaved people reached cities, households, armies, and palaces. Some worked as servants, craftsmen, eunuchs, concubines, soldiers, or administrators. Particularly striking was the role of military slaves, who were trained to become elite troops in some empires and were later even able to gain political power. But even if individual unfree people reached high positions, the basic mechanism remained. People were snatched from their origins, bought, educated, and placed in the service of a ruler. In Christian Europe, bondage was closely linked to landlordship. Monasteries, bishoprics, nobles, and kings owned land and rights over people who lived on it. Monasteries could be places of spiritual education and care, but they were also large economic enterprises. They managed fields, forests, mills, workshops, and dependent farmers. The medieval church preached charity and mercy, but was itself part of the social order that bore dependence and inequality. Some church voices called for lenient treatment, for the release or for the protection of the poor. But for a long time, the church did not fundamentally question the serf's order. As in Antiquity, religion could provide comfort and at the same time stabilize existing rule. For those affected, medieval lack of freedom meant a life full of restrictions, but not without room for maneuver. A serf farmer could have a family, cultivate fields, use local rights, participate in village communities, and live in one place for generations. At the same time, he could be exploited, taxed, punished, and prevented from moving freely. An enslaved person in a household could gain proximity to domination, but also be at the mercy of complete arbitrariness. A prisoner of war could be considered an object of exchange, a source of ransom, or a commodity. A person who fell into debt bondage could hope to work off his obligation, but could also sink into permanent dependence. The medieval world knew many shades of human bondage, and each of these forms was marked by power. Resistance also existed in the Middle Ages. Farmers fled from goods, refused services, negotiated taxes, or joined uprisings. Cities offered some unfree people an opportunity to flee, because in some regions the idea developed that a person could become freer after a long time in a city. City air could mean freedom, at least in certain legal contexts. This made cities places of hope, but also areas of conflict between landlords and urban communities. Where trade, crafts, and the money economy grew, the conditions of dependence also changed. Money could buy freedom, but debt could also create new bondage. The Middle Ages, therefore, do not show an easy development from slavery to freedom. It shows a change in forms. Ancient slavery lost importance in some regions, but serfdom, captivity, and human trafficking remained. Lack of freedom became less visible than in the great Roman slave markets, but it continued to permeate the lives of many people. It was embedded in landlordship, religion, war, trade, and social hierarchy. Man may have been sold openly as a commodity in a market less often, but his work, his place of residence, and his future could still be determined by others. It is precisely these transitional forms that are important for understanding the long history of slavery. They show that lack of freedom does not only exist when a person is formally considered property. It can also exist where people are tied to land, trapped by debt, abducted by violence, or forced into subordination by social order. The Middle Ages were an era in which freedom was not a general right, but a graduated state. Some had a lot of it, others almost nothing. And while kings, knights, merchants, and clergymen ordered their world, countless dependent people bore the burden of this order with their work, their time, and their lives. Chapter 7. The Islamic Slave Trade. The Islamic slave trade was not a single trade, a single route, or a uniform system, but a widely ramified network of markets, wars, caravan routes, port cities, court cultures, and military structures. It did not emerge out of nowhere, but built on older forms of slavery that existed in the Middle East, North Africa, the Mediterranean, Persia, East Africa, and along the trade routes of Asia before the rise of Islam. With the spread of Islamic empires since the 7th century, these older structures were reorganized, expanded, and connected with each other. The Muslim world soon stretched from Spain to North Africa and Egypt to Syria, Iraq, Persia, Central Asia, and later parts of India. This created a huge space in which goods, ideas, people, religions, and power interests circulated. In this space, enslaved people were also traded, abducted, trained, sold, and used in very different areas. The major trade routes played a central role. Caravan routes led through the Sahara from West Africa and the Sahel to North Africa. Through these routes, gold, salt, ivory, fabrics, and also people reached the cities of the Maghreb, Egypt, and further into the Mediterranean region. The desert was not simply an empty border, but a dangerous but important traffic area. Caravans had to rely on water points, oases, protection agreements, and the control of local rulers. Those who mastered these paths could make great profits. Enslaved people were often fed into this trade through wars, raids, tributes, or local power struggles. Some came from sub-Saharan regions, others from border areas where political instability and military violence made people particularly vulnerable. In addition to the Sahara route, East Africa was of great importance. Along the coast of the Indian Ocean, trade links were established between East Africa, Arabia, Persia, India, and later Southeast Asia. Cities such as Kilwa, Mombasa, Mogadishu, or Zanzibar became hubs of a Swahili culture in which African, Arabic, and Persian influences interacted. Enslaved people from East Africa reached the Middle East, Arabia, Persia, and beyond via the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. They were used in households, in fields, in ports, in armies, or at farms. Particularly hard forms of labor occurred in certain agricultural regions, such as the swamps and salt flats of southern Iraq, where African forced laborers were used under extreme conditions. The Great Revolt of the Zanj in the 9th century showed how explosive this exploitation could become. For years, this uprising shook the Abbasid Empire and made it visible that enslaved people were not only victims, but could also develop organized political and military power. The north and east of the Islamic world were also important areas of origin for enslaved people. From Central Asia, the Caucasus, the steppe and Slavic areas, men and women came to the markets of Islamic empires. Wars, border conflicts, and middlemen played a major role in this. People from Turkish, Caucasian, Slavic, or other groups were bought for households, farms, administrations, or military purposes. Their origin often played a role in the tasks assigned to them. African people were often associated with manual labor, household services, or certain court roles, while Turkish or Caucasian men were often particularly valued for military service. Such attributions were not neutral observations, but part of an order that evaluated people according to origin, body, gender, age, and utility. Particularly striking in the Islamic context was the importance of military slaves. In several Islamic empires, young men were bought as slaves, educated to Islam, trained militarily, and placed in the service of rulers. The idea behind it was political. Rulers sought soldiers who were not tied to local tribal ties, family networks, or regional loyalties, but who were directly committed to the court. Uprooting was supposed to give rise to loyalty. These military slaves could become elite troops, gain great influence, and in some cases, take power themselves. The Mamluks in Egypt are the most famous example. They were originally military slaves, became a ruling warrior elite, and eventually ruled Egypt and Syria themselves. This rise shows the contradictory nature of the system. People could be bought as property and yet later become masters over others. This does not abolish the violence of its original enslavement, but shows how flexibly and politically sophisticated slavery was used. Slavery also played a major role in households and palaces. Enslaved women worked as servants, musicians, educators, textile workers, or concubines. Many were at the mercy of sexual availability. In the elites of the Islamic world, concubines could occupy an important position at court, especially if they gave birth to children of a ruler. Some became mothers of princes, advisors, or influential figures in palace networks. But here, too, individual opportunities for advancement should not be confused with freedom. The basis remained the loss of one's own self-determination. Women were often sold far away from their families, forced into new languages, religions, and court rituals, and integrated into an order in which their bodies and fertility could become politically significant. The Islamic legal system accepted slavery as an existing institution, but at the same time tried to regulate it. The enslavement of free Muslims was generally forbidden or severely restricted. Lawful enslavement was mainly associated with war, birth into slavery, or trade from non-Muslim areas. The emancipation of slaves was considered meritorious, sometimes even an act of religious atonement. There were rules on the treatment, release, marriage, and status of children. These norms could improve the lives of individuals or open up pathways to freedom, but they did not eliminate the system. This is precisely where the moral tension is shown. An order could demand mercy toward slaves and still allow people to be bought and sold. She could praise the release, but continue to legally recognize the property of people. The Islamic slave trade differed in important respects from the later transatlantic slave trade. It was older, lasted for many centuries, and was spatially more widely distributed. It was not oriented in the same way towards a single plantation economy overseas, but supplied households, farms, armies, agriculture, administration, and urban markets. Nor did it develop the same rigid, hereditarily racist order everywhere as the plantation systems of America. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to trivialize it for this reason. Here, too, people were forcibly uprooted, transported, sold, and controlled. Here, too, racist ideas, derogatory images, and social hierarchies emerged. Here, too, other people's bodies, work, and sexuality were made into possessions. The number of people affected is particularly difficult to grasp because the trade ran over many centuries, many routes, and very different sources. Many fates were never written down. Caravans did not leave complete lists. Markets did not always document reliably, and the voices of the enslaved are rarely directly preserved. But it is precisely this silence in the sources that must not be misunderstood as emptiness. Behind every anonymous transport, every sale, and every legal category was a person with origin, language, family, fear, and memory. The Islamic slave trade was not only an economic process, but a story of destroyed life paths. At the same time, enslaved and freed people shaped the societies in which they had to live. They brought languages, music, crafts, military skills, religious practices, and cultural memories with them. In cities in the Middle East, North Africa, Persia, and the Indian Ocean, multi-layered societies emerged as a result. Some people were released and started families, others remained dependent, and still others rose to military or courtly positions. Their story is therefore not only a story of suffering, but also a story of adaptation, survival, influence, and resistance. But all these forms of human strength do not change the violence of the beginning. The Islamic slave trade shows how closely religion, war, trade, and statehood could be linked. He shows that great civilizations with science, poetry, architecture, administration, and philosophy were able to support systems of bondage at the same time. The Islamic world produced important scholars, cities, trade networks, and cultural achievements. But as in other civilizations, splendor and violence stood side by side. If you want to understand this story, you have to see both. Not to condemn a culture across the board, but to recognize the power structures that people create wherever economic benefit, political control, and moral justification come together. In the end, this chapter makes it clear that slavery was not an isolated European, African, Christian, Islamic, or ancient phenomenon. It was a global pattern of human rule that manifested itself differently in different cultures. The Islamic slave trade was part of this long history. He connected continents, empires, and markets, but he connected them through the suffering of people who were not asked where they wanted to go, who they wanted to serve, or what kind of life they wanted to lead. This is precisely the deepest truth of every form of slavery. It begins where a person's will is extinguished and replaced by the benefit that others derive from him. Chapter 8. Africa before Atlantic trade. Before European ships appeared on the coasts of West Africa on a large scale and the transatlantic slave trade became one of the most brutal systems in world history, Africa already had diverse societies, empires, trade routes, and forms of social dependence. It would be wrong to think of Africa as a single space before European expansion. The continent was huge, culturally diverse, and politically very differently organized. There were large kingdoms, city-states, nomadic societies, peasant village communities, trading centers, religious networks, and military power structures. In some regions, kinship, land use, and local authority determined life. In others, rich courts, complex administrations, and extensive trade connections emerged. Slavery and dependence were part of this world, but they did not have the same meaning everywhere, and they did not automatically correspond to the later racist plantation system of the Americas. In many African societies, land was not scarce in the same way as labor for a long time. This had major consequences. If you wanted to gain power, you didn't just need land, but people who cultivated fields, herded cattle, practiced crafts, organized trade, performed military service, or strengthened the court of a ruler. Wealth could therefore be defined particularly strongly through people. Those who had many followers, relatives, clients, spouses, children, dependents, or slaves had manpower, prestige, and political strength. In this context, slavery could arise from war, guilt, punishment, hunger, kidnapping, or trade. But it was often embedded in social relationships that differed from the later American plantation slavery. Enslaved people could be taken into households, serve as followers, marry, have children, or achieve a different status over time. This does not mean that their situation was harmless. They were unfree, vulnerable and dependent. But their position was often less strictly determined by an immutable racial category than was to be the case later in the Atlantean system. Wars and imprisonment played an important role. When groups fought with each other, the defeated could be killed, expelled, handed over as tributes, or kept as labor. Captive people were valuable because they could do work and increase the power of the victors. In some societies, prisoners of war were integrated into families or ruling associations. In others, they were sold or held as a sign of victory. Debt bondage could also occur. Anyone who got into trouble, could not fulfill their obligations or sought protection could find themselves in a relationship of dependency. Famines, droughts, local conflicts, or political defeats could make people particularly vulnerable. Lack of freedom thus arose not only from external violence, but also from social crises within individual communities. The great empires of West Africa were particularly important. Ghana, Mali, and later Songhai controlled important trade routes that connected the Sahara with the region south of the desert. Gold, salt, leather, fabrics, cola nuts, and other goods were traded over long distances. Humans also became part of these trade networks. Enslaved people reached North Africa, Egypt, and other parts of the Islamic world via caravan routes. The rulers of these empires benefited from taxes, customs duties, and control over trading centers. Cities such as Timbuktu, Gao, or Jen became places of trade, Islamic scholarship, and political power. In this world, slavery was not isolated, but was associated with long-distance trade, farming, the military, and agriculture. People could be used as servants, soldiers, workers, administrative assistants, or household slaves. Mali under Mansa Musa in the 14th century shows the connection between wealth, religion, trade, and rule particularly clearly. The empire was famous for gold, extensive trade connections, and its integration into the Islamic world. But here, too, dependencies and slavery existed. Rulers' courts needed people for administration, agriculture, military, and personal services. Slaves could be part of royal power, because they were often directly dependent on the ruler and could therefore be considered more reliable than local nobles with their own power bases. This pattern can be found in many regions of the world. Rulers used uprooted or dependent people to strengthen their own authority against rival elites. In Africa, too, slavery could therefore be not only economic, but explicitly political. In Central Africa and in the territory of the later Kingdom of the Congo, complex power structures also existed long before Atlantic trade unfolded its destructive effect. The Kingdom of Congo had political hierarchies, regional rulers, religious beliefs, trade connections, and forms of dependence. When the Portuguese made contact at the end of the 15th century, they did not encounter a world without history, but an organized empire with its own interests. Here, too, there was slavery, prisoners of war, and dependent labor. But the later European demand for more and more enslaved people massively changed the internal dynamics. Existing forms of imprisonment and trade gradually became a system that was increasingly geared towards export, violence, and supplies. Trade networks also existed on the East African coast long before the Atlantic expansion, connecting Africa with Arabia, Persia, India, and the Indian Ocean. The Swahili cities were culturally and economically important centers. Gold, ivory, spices, fabrics, and also people were traded there. Islamic influences combined with African traditions. Enslaved people could play a role in households, on plantations, in ports, or in long-distance trade. These East African trading areas show that Africa did not only enter world history through Europe. For centuries, the continent had been part of super-regional connections in which wealth, culture, and exploitation coexisted. It is important that African societies should not only be understood as victims of external powers, but neither should one relativize the later European responsibility. Before the Atlantic trade, there was slavery, wars, and human trafficking in Africa. African rulers, traders, and local elites could be involved. But the transatlantic slave trade fundamentally changed the extent, direction, and violence of these systems. European demand for labor for plantations in America created a huge market that exacerbated local conflicts, destabilized political orders, and made manhunts more profitable in many regions. Existing forms of lack of freedom were not simply continued, but integrated into a new global system based on mass abduction, racist dehumanization, and colonial profit. Africa before the Atlantic trade was therefore neither an innocent space without any form of bondage nor a continent whose later exploitation could be explained or excused by it. The reality was more complex. People lived in societies with their own rules, power struggles, moral concepts, and economic interests. Some people were protected, others were excluded. Some were able to get promoted, others were sold. Some communities took in strangers, others made prisoners their property. As everywhere in world history, war, hardship, domination, and work combined to form forms of dependence. The decisive difference to the later Atlantic system was that slavery in many African societies was initially more strongly integrated into local and regional structures. It was often not exclusively geared towards the permanent export of millions of people across an ocean. It was not everywhere hereditary in the same rigid form, and not everywhere associated with an all-encompassing ideology that fundamentally equated black skin with permanent servitude. This racist hardening became a world historical power, especially through European colonialism and the plantation economy of the Americas. Therefore, one must know the prehistory without trivializing the later catastrophe. For the people themselves, every form of enslavement meant pain, loss, and insecurity. Whether someone was caught in a local war, forced into a household, paid tribute to a ruler, or sold across the Sahara, it always began with the loss of one's own control. Families were separated, origin became a burden, protection communities collapsed. Nevertheless, people preserved memories, abilities, faith, and dignity. They adapted, negotiated, fled, resisted, or sought ways to put their children in a better position. Even before the Atlantic trade, enslaved people were never just commodities of a story, but acting people in a world full of constraints. This chapter is important because it broadens the view. The history of slavery in Africa does not begin with European ships, but European expansion turned existing forms of dependence into a global system of unprecedented destruction. Anyone who wants to understand this development must take African societies seriously before Atlantic trade, not as marginal figures, but as complex political and social worlds. Only then does it become apparent how dramatic the following incision was. As the demand for plantation economies grew, people were no longer only deported in local power struggles or integrated into regional orders. They were made into a raw material of a world market. And it was precisely this transition that was to change the history of Africa, Europe, and America for centuries. Chapter 9. European expansion and the beginning of Atlantic trade. When European seafarers began to systematically explore the coasts of Africa in the 15th century, the history of slavery changed fundamentally. Not immediately, not with a single ship, and not in a clearly planned development, but step by step a new system emerged that connected Africa, Europe, and America. The European powers sought gold, spices, trade routes, prestige, and religious influence. They wanted to bypass the middlemen of the Mediterranean, gain direct access to African riches, and find new routes to Asia. But this search for trade and power gradually developed into human trafficking, which was to shape world history in its scale and brutality. Portugal played a central role at the beginning of this development. Under the support of the Portuguese royal family, especially in the entourage of Henry the Navigator, expeditions along the West African coast were equipped. The Portuguese slowly felt their way south to open up new trade opportunities. They reached Madeira, the Azores, the Canary Islands, the coasts of Senegal and Guinea, and later the Gulf of Guinea. In the beginning, it was mainly about gold, ivory, pepper, new markets, and the hope of a sea route to India. But very early on, humans also became part of this trade. Portuguese sailors attacked coastal residents, took prisoners, or bought enslaved people from African middlemen. As early as the middle of the 15th century, Africans were brought to Portugal and sold there. This early trade was not yet identical with the later transatlantic mass system. Many of the first enslaved Africans reached Portugal, Spain, Madeira, or other Atlantic islands. There they worked in households, in crafts, in cities, or on agricultural estates. But on the Atlantic islands, something emerged that would later become decisive for America: the plantation economy. Sugar cultivation in particular became a laboratory of colonial exploitation. Sugar was in demand, expensive, and profitable in Europe. Its cultivation required a lot of work, hard discipline, and an organization that combined large areas, mills, processing, and export. In Madeira, and later on São Tomé and other islands, European entrepreneurs tried out a form of production based on forced labor, capital, and long-distance trade. It was here that patterns were created that would later return with even greater brutality in the Caribbean and Brazil. European expansion did not meet an empty Africa, but political empires, coastal companies, merchant networks, and local power relations. African rulers and traders traded with Europeans, negotiated prices, formed alliances, controlled access, and pursued their own interests. Some profited from the prison trade, others tried to limit it or use it against rival groups. In the beginning, the Europeans were often dependent on African partners because they hardly knew the interior of the country and were vulnerable militarily and climatically on the coasts. This is why trade relations were established in which European goods such as metal, fabrics, weapons, alcohol, glass beads, or manufactured products were exchanged for gold, ivory, spices, and people. But these relationships have been marked by violence and inequality from the outset, as human trafficking exacerbated existing conflicts and created new incentives for capture and war. An important turning point was the European conquest of America after 1492. With Christopher Columbus' voyage in the service of the Spanish crown, a new era of colonial expansion began. Spain and Portugal divided their spheres of influence in the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494, with Portugal later claiming Brazil and Spain large parts of Central and South America. In the Americas, Europeans encountered large indigenous societies, empires, and cultures, including the Aztecs, Maya, and Incas. The conquest was marked by war, alliance politics, religious mission, greed for precious metals, and catastrophic diseases. Millions of indigenous people died through violence, forced labor, displacement, and above all, through imported epidemics against which they had no immunity. In the eyes of European colonial rulers, the demographic catastrophe created a labor problem, which they tried to solve with new violence. At first, the Spaniards tried to exploit indigenous labor in systems such as the encomienda. Colonists were given the right to demand taxes and labor from indigenous communities, supposedly in return for protection and Christianization. In practice, this often meant brutal forced labor, abuse, and plundering. The conditions were particularly devastating in mines and on plantations. Clergymen such as Bartolomé de las Casas criticized the cruelty against the indigenous people and campaigned for their protection. But criticism of the exploitation of indigenous people did not automatically lead to an end to colonial coercive systems. Instead, the idea of bringing African workers to America gained weight. This did not end the suffering, but shifted and globalized. The first African slaves arrived in the Spanish colonies at an early age. Some came via Spain and Portugal, others were shipped directly from Africa to America. In the 16th century, this trade increased, especially where plantations, mining, and colonial cities demanded labor. Brazil became one of the most important destinations for enslaved Africans under Portuguese rule. Sugar cultivation on the Brazilian coast developed into a highly profitable system that devoured large amounts of labor. Later, the Caribbean, North America, and other regions were also to be included in this system. The Atlantic became an area of trade, but that trade was based on the destruction of human lives. The connection between Europe, Africa, and America is often described as triangular trade. European traders brought goods to Africa, exchanged them for enslaved people, transported them across the Atlantic to America, and from there brought sugar, tobacco, cotton, coffee, silver, or other products to Europe. This model simplifies the complex reality, but shows the core of the system. People have become a central part of a global supply chain. European consumers enjoyed sugar, tobacco, and later coffee without being directly confronted with violence on plantations and ships. Merchants, shipowners, insurers, port cities, banks, and states benefited. The wealth of many European regions was linked to colonial exploitation, even if this connection was often suppressed or glossed over. Particularly decisive was the development of a new racist justification. In Antiquity and the Middle Ages, slavery often had to do with war, religion, guilt, or origin. People of different skin colors could be enslaved. With the Atlantic trade, however, an ideology increasingly emerged that permanently linked black Africans to slavery. Skin color became a social and legal sign. European colonial powers began to enshrine differences between Europeans, Africans, indigenous peoples, and mixed population groups in laws, church records, work orders, and everyday ideas. This racist order served one purpose. It was to make the mass enslavement of African people appear natural, ordained, or economically necessary. Violence turned into alleged order. Profit became alleged civilization. The church and religious language played a contradictory role in this. On the one hand, European powers often justified expansion and subjugation with mission and Christianization. The baptism was supposedly supposed to save souls, while at the same time bodies were exploited. On the other hand, there were also religious voices that criticized mistreatment, defended human rights in the sense of the time, or protested against certain forms of violence. But the great colonial interests were powerful. Crowns, merchants, and plantation owners found ways to circumvent moral concerns. They claimed that enslaved Africans would benefit from encountering Christianity, or that they presented their labor as necessary for the colonial economy. Such arguments show how dangerous morality can become when it is subordinated to profit. The beginning of Atlantic trade was therefore not a sudden fall into barbarism, but a gradual hardening. Coastal trade became human trafficking. Island plantations became American plantation systems. Prisoners of war became commodities for a world market. Religious distinctions and cultural prejudices gave rise to a racist system that disenfranchised people for generations. This development was not inevitable. It was based on decisions made by rulers, merchants, clergymen, captains, investors, and plantation owners. It was based on the willingness to put profit above humanity. For Africa, this development meant a growing destabilization of many regions. Where the need for enslaved people increased, wars, raids, and political conflicts became more profitable. Some rulers used trade to acquire weapons and expand their power. Other societies have been victims of attacks, abduction, and fear. Entire regions increasingly lived with the threat that people could be stolen and brought to the coast. Trade deeply interfered with local power relations and changed them. It turned human prisoners into a commodity whose value was determined by distant plantations, European markets, and colonial profits. For Europe, the Atlantic trade opened up new sources of wealth, but also a moral guilt that had long been suppressed. Port cities grew, merchants invested, states levied taxes, and colonial empires expanded their power. Sugar on the table, tobacco in the cities, silver in the coins, and cotton in the workshops were associated with coercion, whips, shipping, and destroyed families. European expansion was therefore not only a story of discovery and trade, but also a story of abduction, deprivation of rights, and organized cruelty. At the end of this chapter, there is the beginning of a new epoch. Slavery was not new, but it was now becoming Atlantic, colonial, and increasingly racist. The ocean, which connected continents, became the path to bondage for millions of people. What began on the coasts of Africa, in the ports of Portugal and Spain, on the sugar islands, and in the colonies of the Americas, was to develop in the following centuries into a system that formed entire societies. Atlantic trade was not a sideshow in world history. It became one of its darkest centers. Chapter 10. The Transatlantic Slave Trade. The transatlantic slave trade was one of the most massive crimes in world history. Over several centuries, millions of African men, women, and children were abducted from their home regions, sold to coastal fortresses, crammed into ships, and brought across the Atlantic to America. There they were forced to work on plantations, in mines, in households, in ports, and in cities. This system was not just a series of individual atrocities, but an organized, economically calculated, and politically protected order. It combined African conflicts, European trade interests, and American colonial economy into a cycle in which human life became a commodity. In the beginning, there was almost always violence. People were captured in wars, robbed in raids, given as tribute, sold by political rivals, or brought to the coast by local traders. The European demand for labor in America intensified many of these processes. In some regions of West and Central Africa, existing power struggles have been exacerbated by human trafficking. Weapons, fabrics, metal goods, alcohol, and other European goods were exchanged for prisoners. Some African rulers and traders actively participated in it. Others tried to protect themselves or became victims of this dynamic themselves. However, the responsibility for the Atlantic system lay especially with those European powers and colonial economic structures that created mass demand, equipped ships, controlled markets, and organized the plantation economy. The coasts of West Africa became contact zones of trade and violence. Fortresses, camps, and trading stations were built in places such as Elmina, Ouidah, Luanda, or on island bases. For European merchants, they were hubs of a profitable business. For the deportees, they were places of horror. Many people had to survive long marches from the interior of the country before the crossing. Tied up, guarded, and often poorly cared for, they were driven to the coast. Some died on the way from exhaustion, hunger, disease, or abuse. Those who reached the coast were often already torn from their family, their language, their village, and their previous world. In the fortresses and camps, people were examined, sorted, evaluated, and prepared for sale. The human body became a commercial quantity. The crossing of the Atlantic, the so-called Middle Passage, was one of the cruelest experiences of this system. The ships were not built for human dignity, but for profit. Captains and investors calculated how many prisoners could be squeezed into the hold without too many dying. Men were often chained, and women and children were also closely monitored. The rooms were cramped, dark, hot, and stuffy. Diseases spread quickly. Vomiting, blood, excretions, shortness of breath, wounds, and despair determined everyday life below deck. Many people did not understand where they were being taken. Some believed that they would be killed or eaten by the Europeans because the destination of the journey seemed completely incomprehensible to them. This fear was not a sign of ignorance, but an expression of a situation in which every familiar sense was broken. The violence on the ships was omnipresent. Those who resisted were beaten, tied up, or killed. Women were also exposed to sexual violence by crew members. Diseases such as dysentery, smallpox, fever, and inflammation could spread rapidly. Hunger strikes occurred because some deportees preferred to die rather than be brought further into bondage. Some jumped overboard when an opportunity presented itself. Others tried to organize riots. There were ships on which prisoners fought against the crew, even if their chances were slim. Each of these acts shows that the abductees were not willless. Even in a situation of utter powerlessness, people looked for ways to determine their own fate. For the European traders, the Middle Passage was part of a calculation. Mortality was included in calculations. Insurance companies, investors, ship owners, and merchants treated human lives as a financial risk. When prisoners died, it was a loss for them like damaged goods. This cold logic makes the transatlantic slave trade particularly shocking. The cruelty arose not only from the spontaneous brutality of individual captains, but from an entire economic system in which profit destroyed moral perception. A system that plans for the death of people as a cost factor has long since crossed the line between trade and crime. Once in America, the violence did not end. The survivors were sold in ports, often re-examined, evaluated, and separated. Families who had stayed together on the crossing, or even before, could now be torn apart for good. Buyers pay attention to strength, age, health, gender, and supposed ability to work. The names of the people were often changed or erased. They were forced into new languages, subjected to new masters, and incorporated into work orders whose goal was not their lives but their exploitation. Especially in the Caribbean and Brazil, plantation work was murderous. Sugarcane had to be planted, cut, transported, and processed quickly. The work was hard, dangerous, and strictly organized in terms of time. There was a threat of serious injuries in the sugar mills, heat, exhaustion, and penalties in the fields. In North America, in the Spanish colonies and in other regions, enslaved Africans and their descendants were also forced to work. Depending on the location, the focus was on sugar, tobacco, rice, coffee, cotton, indigo, silver mining, or municipal services. The forms of work differed, but the basis remained the same. People were considered property. Their workforce, their families, their movements, and often their bodies were controlled. Children of enslaved women inherited the status of mothers in many colonies. This made slavery hereditary and permanent. This rule was of enormous importance because it turned stolen labor power into a self-renewing system. Birth became a mechanism of bondage. With the transatlantic slave trade, a racist world order also solidified. Black skin was increasingly associated with slavery in the colonies, while European origin was associated with freedom, domination, and legal primacy. This order had to be invented and constantly confirmed because it was not natural. It served to morally and legally stabilize a cruel system. Laws regulated clothing, movement, assembly, marriage, punishments, testimony, and property rights. Enslaved people should not only work, but also be kept down socially. Racism was therefore not only a prejudice, but a tool of domination. He helped the owners to make their violence appear supposedly normal. But this system was never stable because it was based on the oppression of people who had not forgotten their freedom. Resistance began in Africa, continued on the ships, and shaped life in America. People fled plantations, founded communities of escaped slaves, preserved religious traditions, created new languages, sabotaged labor, negotiated, feigned obedience, or planned uprisings. In the Caribbean, Brazil, North America, and the Spanish colonies, forms of African and African American culture emerged that survived despite violence. Music, faith, stories, healing knowledge, family ties, and memory became means of survival. The enslaved were not just victims of a system, but people who created new communities and forms of resistance under extreme conditions. The figures of the transatlantic slave trade are difficult to fully grasp, but they make the extent visible. Millions of people have been shipped from Africa, and even more have been affected by wars, marches, camps, and the consequences of trade. Behind every number is a life. A mother who lost her child. A boy who was torn from his village. A woman who was given a new name that she had not chosen. A man who lay in chains below deck and didn't know if he would survive the sea. History must not only regard these people as a mass. Precisely because the system wanted to commodify it, the narrative must bring back its humanity. The transatlantic slave trade was more than a trade. It was a violent reordering of the world. Africa lost millions of people and was politically and socially shaken in many regions. America was economically shaped by the labor of enslaved people. Europe built wealth, trading power, and colonial strength on a system that preached freedom and practiced unfreedom. This contradiction gave rise to conflicts, guilt, resistance, and consequences that are still felt today. In the end, the realization remains that the Atlantic was not a space of discovery for millions of people, but a sea of separation. It separated families, languages, religions, and life paths. But it also connected memories, cultures, and struggles. The violence of deportation gave rise to new communities, new forms of faith, new music, new political demands, and an unbroken will for freedom. The transatlantic slave trade wanted to turn people into property. But he could not prevent these people from carrying on their dignity, their memory, and their claim to freedom. Chapter 11. Plantations, Sugar, Cotton, and Capital. The history of slavery in the Atlantean world cannot be understood by looking only at ships, markets, and laws. You have to look at the plantations, because there the delayed human labor was transformed into colonial wealth. The plantation was not just a large farm. It was a system of land grabbing, violence, discipline, capital, technology, trade, and racist rule. On it, European demand, colonial power, and the forced labor of African people combined to form an economic form that shaped entire regions. Sugar, tobacco, coffee, rice, indigo, and later cotton were not just commodities. They were products of a system that turned people into tools of profit and at the same time combined modern economic structures with brutal lack of freedom. Sugar was one of the first and most important products of this development. In Europe, sugar was long considered a luxury good. It was used in pharmacies, kitchens, and courtly households, was expensive and sought after. With the expansion of the plantation economy to Madeira, São Tomé, Brazil, and later in the Caribbean, sugar gradually became a mass product. But behind this transformation was an enormous human violence. Sugarcane was a hard plant. It required hard work in the fields, fast harvesting, dangerous processing, and strict organization. When the pipe was cut, it had to be brought quickly to the mill so that the juice could be extracted and further processed. The work was physically exhausting, tightly timed, and accompanied by constant supervision. Agriculture and early industry merged on sugar plantations. Fields, mills, boiler houses, warehouses, workshops, and ports formed a production chain that could hardly have functioned in this form without coercion. Especially in the Caribbean, the sugar plantation became a place of extreme exploitation. Islands such as Barbados, Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, Martinique, and Guadeloupe became centers of an economy based on enslaved labor. European colonial powers fought over these islands because sugar promised huge profits. The soils were used for monocultures, forests were cleared, indigenous populations had already been decimated by violence, disease, and coercion, and African people were forced to work in large numbers. Life on many sugar plantations was so brutal that mortality was alarmingly high. Plantation owners often reckoned with death. Instead of fundamentally improving living conditions, they bought new people. The plantation thus became a place where human life was consumed like fuel. The violence was not accidental, but part of the order. Enslaved people worked under guards, were punished, controlled, and forced into strict daily routines. Whips, shackles, humiliations, and threats were intended to enforce obedience. At the same time, the owners tried to control any form of community because they knew that family, religion, language, and cohesion could strengthen resistance. But it was precisely on the plantations that new cultural worlds emerged. People from different regions of Africa met and brought memories, languages, rituals, music, healing knowledge, and beliefs with them. Under the conditions of violence, they developed new forms of living together. They created families, even if they could be torn apart at any time. They sang, prayed, told, healed, helped each other, and preserved dignity in an order that wanted to take away exactly this dignity. In addition to sugar, tobacco played an important role, especially in the English colonies of North America. In Virginia and Maryland, a plantation economy emerged from the 17th century onwards, which was initially based on European contract servants, but then increasingly on the permanent enslavement of African people. Tobacco was labor-intensive. The plants had to be cared for, harvested, dried, sorted, and prepared for export. With the expansion of cultivation, the need for workers grew. At the same time, laws were created that permanently disenfranchised African people and their descendants. The transition to a racially defined slave society did not happen overnight, but through many legal and economic decisions. Children of enslaved women inherited their mother's status. Marriages could be prevented or ignored. Freedom of movement was restricted. Witness testimony, property rights and bodily self-determination were limited or denied. Thus, the plantation became not only a place of work, but also a laboratory of racist legislation. In the 18th and 19th centuries, cotton became one of the most powerful products of the slave economy. Especially after the invention of the cotton ginning machine in the United States, production increased sharply. The textile industry in Britain, Europe, and later in the northern United States demanded more and more raw cotton. Cotton connected the fields of the American South with factories, ports, banks, and world markets. Enslaved people planted, chopped, picked, and sorted cotton under enormous pressure. The work in the fields was monotonous, painful, and strictly monitored. Daily quotas determined life. Anyone who did not comply with them had to expect penalties. Thus, the body of the enslaved human being was directly bound to the rhythm of the world market. Increasing demand in European factories could show up as increasing pressure in a field in Mississippi or Alabama. Cotton slavery refutes the idea that slavery was only a pre-modern remnant. It was deeply connected to the modern economy. Banks granted loans to plantations and people, insurance companies secured transport, traders organized exports, factories processed raw materials, states benefited from taxes and customs duties. Enslaved people were listed as assets on balance sheets, used as collateral for loans, and divided into inheritances. This was not chaotic cruelty on the fringes of civilization, but an organized economic order with contracts, accounts, markets, and political protection mechanisms. This is precisely what makes them so frightening. Modern instruments of capital were not developed in spite of slavery, but were intertwined with it in many areas. European port cities also benefited. Liverpool, Bristol, Nantes, Bordeaux, Lisbon, Amsterdam, and other places were involved in the slave trade, colonial goods, shipbuilding, insurance, or processing in different ways. Not every citizen of these cities was directly a slave trader, but the profits from colonial goods shaped entire economic areas. Sugar refineries, textile manufacturers, trading companies, and banks were connected to the plantation world. The violence was often far away, but their products were on European tables, in European warehouses, and in European account books. This distance was morally comfortable. It allowed people to sweeten sugar, drink coffee, smoke tobacco, or wear cotton cloth without seeing the pain that was in those goods. The plantation owners often saw themselves as masters of an orderly world. They spoke of discipline, property, progress, and economic necessity. Many did not see themselves as criminals, but as entrepreneurs, patriarchs, or defenders of a supposedly natural order. This was precisely the ideological power of slavery. It created a language in which violence appeared as administration. Punishment was called education. Exploitation was portrayed as a duty to work. Racist theories claimed that Africans were suitable for hard work or needed the guidance of white masters. Such ideas were not mere prejudices on the margins. They served to mentally stabilize a huge injustice and ward off criticism. But the plantation was never just a place of control. It was also a place of resistance. Enslaved people slowed down work, destroyed tools, fled, hid food, preserved forbidden religious practices, learned secretly, passed on messages, and helped each other. In many regions, communities of escaped slaves, the so-called Maroons, emerged, who founded their own settlements in mountains, forests, or swamps and defended themselves militarily. In Haiti, then Saint-Domingue, the resistance of enslaved people eventually led to the Haitian Revolution, which shook the world's most powerful sugar plantation system and led to the establishment of an independent state. These events showed that despite all the violence, the plantation was not omnipotent. Where oppression prevailed, the will to freedom also lived. The economic power of the plantations had long-term consequences. It enriched elites, financed trade networks, strengthened colonial empires, and shaped racist social orders. At the same time, it destroyed soils, displaced other forms of economy, and made entire regions dependent on a few export products. In America, societies emerged in which skin color, property and freedom were closely linked. In Africa, the demand for labor exacerbated violence and kidnapping. In Europe, consumption habits and industries were linked to colonial exploitation. The plantation was thus a hub of a global history. It associated breakfast tables with whips, factories with fields, bank loans with human chains, and political power with everyday suffering. In the end, this chapter shows that slavery and capital were not separate worlds. Modern economic history is not only a history of inventions, markets, and entrepreneurship, but also a history of coercion, colonialism, and stolen labor. Sugar, cotton, and other plantation products were sweet, soft, or useful to consumers, but for millions of people, they meant pain, separation, and exhaustion. The plantation turned people into means of production, but it could not prevent these people from preserving their humanity. In the songs, escapes, uprisings, family ties, and memories of the enslaved, a truth lived on that was stronger than any balance sheet. No profit can justify making one person the property of another. Chapter 12. Life in Slavery. Life in slavery was determined not only by work, but by the constant attempt of a system to dispose of every part of human existence. Enslaved people were not only supposed to cultivate fields, cut sugarcane, pick cotton, dry tobacco, clean houses, or carry goods. They should obey, remain silent, submit, and subordinate their own future to the will of others. Slavery intervened in the body, in the family, in the language, in the faith, in the memory, and in the feeling of being a self-determined person. Precisely for this reason, this life cannot be described only as economic exploitation. It was an attack on the whole person. And yet the enslaved have always managed to preserve humanity, cohesion, culture, and resistance in the midst of this violence. Everyday life depended heavily on where a person lived and what work they had to do. On the large plantations of America, the day often began before sunrise. Overseers drove the people to the fields, where they worked under heat, humidity, rain, or burning sun. Sugar plantations were among the hardest places to work, because harvesting and processing had to be precisely coordinated. When the sugarcane was cut, it had to get to the mill quickly. The work was dangerous, because sharp tools, heavy bundles, mills, boiling cauldrons, and exhaustion repeatedly led to injuries. Cotton fields demanded a different form of hardness. The work was long, monotonous, and often determined by daily quotas. Those who did not pick enough had to expect penalties. In tobacco, rice, and coffee plantations, on the other hand, there were their own pollution, from stagnant moisture in rice fields to toxic plant substances and heavy physical work. In cities, life could look different, but it could not be free. Enslaved people worked as craftsmen, coachmen, dock workers, saleswomen, servants, cooks, washerwomen, nurses, bricklayers, musicians, or personal servants. Some had more freedom of movement than field workers, were able to travel around the city, sell goods, or generate money for their owners. Some were able to put aside small amounts and hope to be ransomed. But even this seemingly greater freedom remained uncertain. It could be withdrawn at any time. An owner could sell, punish, separate, or order new tasks. In households, proximity to the owner family was often particularly dangerous, because control and arbitrariness reached into the private sphere. Enslaved women in particular were at the mercy of sexual violence and constant availability. Their bodies were seen not only as labor, but also as possessions that others wanted to dispose of. Family was one of the most important places of humanity for enslaved people, and at the same time one of the most vulnerable. Many tried to form partnerships, raise children, maintain kinship, and form communities. Parents told their children stories, passed on values to them, taught them caution, hope, and survival. Marriages could be ignored, children could be sold, parents could be separated, siblings could be taken to different plantations. This permanent threat was one of the cruelest aspects of slavery. It meant that love itself was under the shadow of loss. A person could still be part of a family in the morning and sold to another owner in the evening. Nevertheless, families and communities did not simply break up. Enslaved people developed forms of mutual aid. Older people took care of children, neighbors became surrogate relatives, religious communities created cohesion, and memories of origins were preserved in stories, songs, names, food, and rituals. Many family histories could not be lived in full public, but they continued to exist in secret. Precisely where the law tried to make people property, community became an act of resistance. Protecting a child, passing on a song, helping a sick person, or preserving a memory could have deep political significance in a slave society, even if it seemed like an everyday occurrence on the outside. Religion played a special role in the lives of many enslaved people. African beliefs were brought to the New World, where they met Christianity, indigenous traditions, and new experiences of violence. This gave rise to a variety of religious forms, different depending on the region. In the Caribbean, Brazil, North America, and other parts of America, African rituals, music, dances, spirit performances, healing practices, and Christian images combined to form new spiritual worlds. Religion was comfort, a language of suffering, a reminder of origins, and the hope of liberation. For owners, religion could be a means of control when preachers taught obedience. For the enslaved, however, the same religion could contain a message of freedom. The story of the Exodus from Egypt, of a God who sees the oppressed, or of justice beyond violence, became an inner source of strength. Language and culture were also battlefields. People from different African regions were deliberately mixed to make common origins and communication more difficult. But this forced mixture gave rise to new languages, dialects, songs, and forms of expression. In some regions, Creole languages developed, combining African, European, and other influences. Music became a carrier of memory, rhythm, work, grief, and resistance. Songs could accompany work, encode messages, express pain, or preserve hope. Body movements, dances, drums, shouts, and religious gatherings also carried meanings that owners often feared. For this reason, drums, nocturnal meetings, or certain rituals were forbidden or strictly monitored in some colonies. Education was another area of control. Many slave societies prevented enslaved people from learning to read and write, especially where writing was considered a threat to order. Those who could read could interpret Bible passages themselves, spread the news, forge escape passports, absorb political ideas, or better understand the world beyond the plantation. That is why reading was an act of resistance in many regions. Some learned in secret, supported by free blacks, poor whites, religious groups, or other enslaved people. Every letter could be dangerous, because knowledge meant power. The owner's fear of education showed that slavery wanted to control not only bodies, but also consciousness. Punishments served to intimidate. Lashes, shackles, branding, mutilations, imprisonments, deprivation of food, public humiliation, and sale were all means of enforcing obedience. Sales in particular were used as a psychological weapon. An owner could threaten to sell a person to a more distant, harder region or to separate him from his family. This violence was not only intended to affect the individual, but to show everyone else what was possible. Slavery was based on fear, and this fear had to be constantly renewed, because the system knew that no human being wanted to be someone else's property voluntarily. But resistance was omnipresent. Not every resistance was a great uprising. It was often quiet, commonplace, and difficult to see. People worked more slowly, broke tools, feigned illness, hid crops, stole food, preserved forbidden traditions, or helped others to escape. Women used welfare networks to pass on information. Men and women fled to forests, swamps, mountains, or cities. Some formed communities of escaped slaves that defended themselves and lasted for years or generations. Others fought openly in revolts. Each of these acts was a sign that the will to freedom could not be extinguished. Life in slavery was therefore marked by a deep contradiction. The owners wanted to turn people into things, but they had to deal with their humanity every day. They needed their skills, their experience, their language, their strength, their nursing work, their craftsmanship, and their knowledge. At the same time, they feared their thoughts, their communities, their memories, and their dreams of freedom. The more control was exercised, the clearer it became that this control was necessary because slavery was against human will. For the enslaved people, survival meant more than just continuing to live. It meant preserving something of one's own under inhumane conditions. A mother who gave her child a name contradicted a world that saw this child as property. A man who retained a memory of his homeland contradicted an order that wanted to uproot him. A community that sang, prayed, or mourned together contradicted a power that wanted to isolate it. These forms of survival were not small. They were an expression of a humanity that was stronger than the law of the owners. In the end, this chapter shows that slavery did not only take place on plantations, markets, and ships, but in the innermost part of life. She reached for time, the body, the family, faith, and memory. But it failed to completely destroy man. Enslaved people suffered, but they acted. They were separated, but they formed new bonds. They were forced to remain silent, but they found voices in songs, prayers, stories, and escapes. Her life was surrounded by violence, but it was not only defined by violence. It was also a story of dignity, courage, adaptation, grief, hope, and an unbroken claim to freedom. Chapter 13. Resistance, Flight, and Uprisings. Slavery was never a state of silent submission. It was a system of violence, but it was also a system that was constantly challenged. Wherever people were enslaved, resistance arose. Sometimes he was open, loud, and armed. Sometimes it was quiet, hidden, and commonplace. It could consist of an uprising, an escape, a clandestine gathering, a sabotage tool, a refused order, a song, a memory, or a decision not to let its owners define its humanity. Anyone who tells the story of slavery only as a history of oppression overlooks a crucial truth. The enslaved were not just victims. They were active people who sought ways to preserve their dignity and gain freedom under extreme conditions. Everyday resistance was probably the most common form of resistance. It was harder to recognize than a rebellion, but dangerous for the system because it was constantly happening. Enslaved people worked more slowly, deliberately breaking tools, feigning illness, hiding supplies, letting animals escape, passing on information, or disobeying instructions if they were not observed. Such actions may seem small individually, but when taken together, they attacked the control of the owners. Every act of refusal showed that this was an illusion. The body could be forced, but the will remained a contested space. The escape was particularly important. It was a direct rejection of the claim to ownership. Those who fled declared by the deed that no law, no contract of sale, and no whip had the right to determine their lives. Escape, however, was dangerous. Enslaved people had to know paths, find food, avoid pursuers, and often get through unknown terrain. In plantation areas, search parties, dogs, bounties, and harsh punishments threatened. Nevertheless, people fled again and again. Some only for a short time to escape abuse, visit relatives, or put pressure on owners. Others tried to disappear permanently, reach cities, cross borders, pretend to be free, or find communities of escaped slaves. Such communities, often referred to as Maroons, sprang up in many parts of the Americas. In the mountains of Jamaica, the swamps and forests of Brazil, the hard-to-reach regions of the Caribbean, in parts of Suriname, Colombia, and other colonies, escaped people built their own settlements. There they created new social orders, defended themselves against colonial troops, and preserved African and newly developed cultural traditions. Some Maroon communities have existed for generations. They were constant proof that the plantation order was not complete. For the colonial powers, they were a military and symbolic threat, because their mere existence showed all the enslaved that a different life could be possible. In Brazil, Palmares was one of the best-known examples. In the 17th century, this large community of escaped slaves developed into a resilient community that existed for decades against Portuguese attacks. Palmares was not just a place of refuge, but a political and social order with defense, agriculture, leadership, and culture. The memory of Zumbi, one of Palmares' most famous leaders, later became a symbol of black resistance in Brazil. Such communities show that flight was not always just an individual act. It could become the basis of new societies in which people tried to live their own forms of freedom beyond colonial violence. There was also resistance on the ships of transatlantic trade. The Middle Passage was a place of extreme control, but even their deportees tried to defend themselves. Some refused food. Others jumped overboard to avoid the fate of enslavement. Still others organized uprisings against the occupation. Such revolts were dangerous because the prisoners were often shackled, weakened, linguistically separated, and poorly armed. But again and again they managed to communicate, loosen chains, seize weapons, or attack the crew. Most of these uprisings were crushed, but they show that resistance did not start on the plantations. It began at the moment of capture, on the marches to the coast, in the fortresses, and on the sea. Great uprisings shook the slave societies again and again. They arose where desperation, organization, leadership, religious hope, political crises, and opportunities converged. Owners deeply feared such uprisings because they knew that the number of enslaved people in many regions significantly exceeded that of the free white population. As a result, colonial societies often reacted with extreme violence. Even rumors of conspiracies could lead to arrests, torture, and executions. The fear of rebellion shaped laws, police systems, militias, and the entire thinking of the slaveholders. A society that preached freedom and at the same time enslaved people constantly lived with the knowledge that one day the oppressed could one day demand this freedom themselves. The most significant uprising in the history of Atlantic slavery was the Haitian Revolution. It began in 1791 in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, the richest sugar and coffee colonial area in the world. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved people lived there under particularly brutal conditions. The French Revolution had introduced terms such as freedom, equality, and civil rights into political language in Europe, but slavery remained in the colonies. This tension was explosive. Enslaved people heard about the ideas of the revolution, pointed them to their own situation, and linked them to their own experiences, African traditions, religious practices, and the desire for liberation. The uprising in Saint-Domingue was not just a spontaneous outbreak of violence. It developed into a long, complex revolutionary war. Enslaved people burned down plantations, attacked the order of the colony, and forced the French authorities to make decisions they had previously wanted to avoid. Personalities such as Toussaint Louverture became central figures in this struggle. Louverture was a formerly enslaved man who combined military talent, political skill, and strategic patience. He did not simply fight against local plantation owners, but moved in an international field of power between France, Spain, Great Britain, and the interests of the various groups on the island. The revolution eventually led to the abolition of slavery in the colony and Haiti's independence in 1804. The importance of Haiti can hardly be overestimated. For the first time, formerly enslaved people succeeded in overthrowing a large slave colony and founding their own state. For enslaved people in other regions, Haiti was a sign of hope. For slave owners in America and Europe, it was a nightmare. The revolution proved that the most powerful plantation economy in the world could break through the resistance of the enslaved. This is precisely why Haiti has been isolated, feared, and punished by many powers. Haiti's freedom was a challenge to the racist world order. She challenged the claim that black people were destined to be unfree, showing that they could not only demand freedom, but also create political order. There were also numerous forms of resistance in North America. Uprisings such as the Stono Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina or later conspiracies and revolts showed the tension within slave society. People like Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, and Nat Turner became names that sparked fear in slave owners and were remembered by later generations as a sign of resistance. Nat Turner's rebellion of 1831 in particular led to a wave of brutal repression. Laws against enslaved and free black people have been tightened, education has been further restricted, and assemblies have been monitored more closely. Such reactions show how much the slave ownership order was determined by fear. She knew that she could only survive through violence. But resistance was not only male and not only armed. Women played a central role, often in ways that are less visible in the sources. They maintained family ties, passed on knowledge, hid fugitives, organized food, used market routes for news, healed the sick, protected children, and resisted sexual violence wherever possible. Some women fled themselves, fought in uprisings, or became religious and social leaders. The resistance of enslaved women must be taken particularly seriously because they have often been subjected to a double violence: the exploitation of their labor and the disposal of their bodies. Their forms of survival and refusal were an essential part of the struggle against slavery. Culture was also resistance. Songs could contain coded messages or preserve memories of Africa. Stories could convey to children that the world of owners was not the only truth. Religious gatherings could create hope and community. Funerals, prayers, dances, and healing rituals could give the enslaved a space in which they experience themselves not only as the property of others, but as people with a past and future. Even where the owners believed they controlled everything, inner worlds emerged that eluded their power. Resistance was therefore not only the moment when someone grabbed a weapon. Resistance was also the refusal to surrender one's own soul to the system. The escape routes became more organized over time. In North America, a network of helpers, safe houses, and secret routes emerged in the 19th century, which later became known as the Underground Railroad. Free black communities, abolitionist whites, religious groups, and former slaves helped people get from the southern states to free states or Canada. This aid was dangerous, especially under laws that were intended to force the repatriation of escaped slaves. But it showed that resistance to slavery was not only supported by the enslaved themselves, but also found allies. At the same time, it must remain clear that the main burden and the greatest risk were borne by those who fled. In the end, the story of resistance, flight, and uprisings shows that slavery was never a fully controlled order. It was constantly threatened by the desire for freedom of the people it subjugated. The owners could write laws, put on chains, form militias, and impose punishments. But they could not prevent people from dreaming, planning, fleeing, fighting, and remembering. All resistance, big or small, challenged the basic lie of slavery, the claim that one man can be the property of another. This chapter is therefore a turning point in history. It shows that the abolition of slavery did not only come from parliaments, philosophers, or reform movements. It was also enforced by the enslaved themselves, through their daily lives, their escapes, their revolts, and their refusal to assume the role assigned to them. The history of slavery is incomplete without the history of this resistance. Because in the resistance, what the system feared most becomes visible: that the people it disenfranchised not only longed for their freedom, but actively fought for it. Chapter 14. Abolition and its Limits. The abolition of slavery was not a single moment when humanity suddenly came to its senses. It was a long, contradictory, and often bloody process that was conducted over many decades. It arose from moral outrage, religious commitment, economic changes, political struggles, revolutions, wars, and above all, from the resistance of the enslaved people themselves. No parliament, no king, and no government gave up freedom simply out of pure goodness. Slavery was put under pressure, attacked, defended, re-established, legally restricted, and finally abolished in many regions. But even where it formally ended, its consequences did not disappear. Freedom on paper did not automatically mean equality in life. This is precisely the tragedy and the significance of this chapter. As early as the 18th century, a movement grew in Europe and North America that increasingly regarded slavery and the slave trade as a moral crime. Especially in Great Britain, religious groups such as the Quakers played an important role. They argued that no human being should be the property of another, and that slavery was incompatible with Christian charity. Evangelical Christians, enlightened thinkers, former slaves, and political activists also contributed to the emergence of abolitionism. The term refers to the movement to abolish slavery and the slave trade. But this movement was never uniform. Some only wanted to end the trade at first, but not slavery itself immediately. Others demanded complete and immediate liberation. Still others thought in colonial and paternalistic categories and did not really see former slaves as equal citizens. The fight against slavery was therefore from the beginning also a struggle for the meaning of freedom. People who had been enslaved themselves played a special role. Their accounts made visible what slavery really meant. Autobiographies, speeches and testimonies of former slaves broke through the comfortable distance of the European and American publics. They told of violence, family destruction, hunger, fear, work, flight, and the desire for dignity. These voices were dangerous for the slave owners because they destroyed the central lie of the system. Slave owners liked to claim that enslaved people were content, incapable of freedom, or dependent on the guidance of their masters. The reports of formerly enslaved people showed the opposite. They proved that those affected understood very well the injustice done to them and that they were capable of interpreting their experiences politically, morally, and literarily. In Great Britain, the slave trade was banned in 1807. This was a significant step, but it was not the end of slavery in the British colonies. Trade across the Atlantic became illegal, but already enslaved people remained unfree. It was not until 1833 that the British Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which ended slavery in large parts of the British Empire. But here, too, freedom was limited. In many cases, former slaves were initially forced into so-called apprenticeship systems, which continued to control their workforce. It was particularly bitter that it was not the enslaved who were compensated, but the slave owners. The state paid huge sums to owners because they had allegedly lost property. This fact shows how deep the logic of slavery was still in the institutions. Even at the moment of abolition, the loss of the masters was financially recognized, while the suffering of the enslaved was not adequately compensated. Other European powers also ended the slave trade and slavery gradually, often under international pressure, through political upheavals or economic changes. France temporarily abolished slavery during the French Revolution in 1794, but reintroduced it under Napoleon in 1802. It was not until 1848 that it was finally abolished in the French colonies. This return of slavery under Napoleon shows that freedom must by no means be understood as irreversible progress. If economic interests, racist ideas, and colonial power were strong enough, rights that had already been achieved could be destroyed again. The history of abolition is therefore not a straight line upwards, but a struggle with setbacks. In this context, the Haitian Revolution was of world historical importance. In Saint-Domingue, enslaved people did not wait for a parliament to grant them freedom. They fought for it themselves. Haiti's independence in 1804 called into question the entire Atlantic slave order. A state founded by formerly enslaved people was a living contradiction to the racist theories of the time. But it is precisely for this reason that Haiti has been isolated and put under economic pressure. Many powers feared that the example could inspire other slave revolts. So Haiti's freedom was real, but it was punished from the outside. This is also one of the limits of abolition. A liberated society had to exist in a world that did not want to recognize its freedom. In the United States, slavery became the central political issue of the 19th century. While the northern states were more strongly influenced by industry, trade, and free wage labor, the economy of the southern states remained deeply linked to plantation slavery. Cotton in particular made slavery enormously profitable. The owners claimed that their system was natural, Christian, economically necessary, and even beneficial to the enslaved. At the same time, they tightened control, violence, and racist laws. Every dispute over new territories also became a dispute about whether slavery would spread further. The question was not just whether slavery should endure, but whether it would determine the future of the United States. The American Civil War from 1861 to 1865 was therefore inextricably linked to slavery. The southern states separated from the Union to defend a social order in which slavery was central. President Abraham Lincoln initially appeared primarily with the goal of preserving the Union, but as the war progressed, the abolition of slavery became a crucial war goal. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 declared slaves free in the rebellious territories, and the 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolished slavery in the United States in 1865. But here, too, freedom was not the end of the struggle. The former slaves faced a devastated economy, racist violence, lack of land ownership, political insecurity, and a society that fiercely fought for their equality. After the Civil War, the phase of Reconstruction began, in which formerly enslaved people received civil rights, became politically active, founded schools, reunited families, and took up public office. For a brief moment, a profound transformation seemed possible. But these hopes were massively attacked by white terror, political compromise, and racist legislation. Organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan spread violence to prevent black political participation. Later, the so-called Jim Crow laws were created, which enshrined racial segregation, deprivation of rights, and social subordination. Slavery had been abolished, but their power relations lived on in new forms. Property became segregation. Whip became lynch justice. Plantation compulsion turned into debt bondage, lease labor, and economic dependence. In Brazil, the country that took in more enslaved Africans than any other region of the Americas, slavery lasted particularly long. Brazil gradually abolished the transatlantic slave trade under pressure in the 19th century, but maintained slavery itself until 1888. With the Lei Aurea, the Golden Law, slavery was finally formally ended. But even there, the former slaves received hardly any land, compensation, or social support. The old elite retained property, power, and influence, while the liberated had to live in poverty and racial exclusion. The abolition ended the property relationship, but not the social inequality that had arisen from it. A recurring pattern can be seen in many regions. Slavery was abolished, but the economic foundations of freedom were often denied to the liberated. Freedom without land, without education, without political protection, without security, and without recognition remained vulnerable. Many former slaves had to continue working for former owners, now as tenants, day laborers, or bonded laborers. Contracts replaced chains, but the balance of power often remained similar. Those who had no land, no reserves, no legal support, and no social recognition were formally free, but practically dependent. The abolition of slavery was therefore necessary, but not sufficient on its own. The memory of slavery was also fought over. Slave owners and their descendants often tried to gloss over the past. They spoke of loyal servants, benevolent masters, or a supposedly harmonious order. Such narratives served to ward off guilt and justify existing inequalities. On the other hand, there were the memories of the liberated, their family histories, churches, schools, political movements, and later scientific works. Memory itself became a field of freedom. Whoever is allowed to tell what happened helps determine how a society understands itself. The limits of abolition are still evident today. The aftermath of slavery is not only in monuments, archives, and old laws. They manifest themselves in social inequalities, racist ideas, economic structures, and political conflicts. Abolition ended a legal system, but it did not erase centuries of dispossession, violence, and dehumanization. For a long time, many societies had to refuse to acknowledge these consequences. Some still do it today. But without this recognition, freedom remains incomplete, because the past continues to operate in secret. At the end of this chapter, therefore, there is a double realization. The abolition of slavery was a huge step forward and the result of courageous struggles. It saved future generations from the legal status of property and opened up spaces for education, family, political participation, and self-determination. But it was not a magical conclusion. Many liberated people did not receive justice, but only permission to survive in a hostile order. The question of freedom therefore remained open. It was no longer just, who owns a person's body? It now read, who owns land, power, rights, security, voice, and dignity? The history of abolition reminds us that freedom is more than the end of a chain. Freedom needs protection, recognition, material foundations, and equal rights. It must be defended against those who want to preserve old rule in new forms. Slavery could be legally ended because people fought, wrote, fled, rebelled, preached, organized, and died. But the task of understanding its consequences and seeking justice remained. This is precisely why the history of slavery does not end with its abolition. It leads further into the present, into memory, into political struggles, and into the question of how a society lives with an injustice that it cannot undo. Chapter 15. Modern Slavery and the Legacy of the Past. The history of slavery does not end with a law, not with a signature on a decree of abolition, and not with the symbolic moment when chains were loosened. The legal abolition of slavery was a huge historic step, but it did not erase the consequences of centuries of exploitation, nor did it eliminate all forms of modern bondage. Today, there is hardly a state that openly allows slavery. In the constitutions, declarations of human rights, and international treaties of the present day, freedom is considered a fundamental right. And yet forms of coercion, exploitation, and human trafficking continue to exist. They have different names, often function more covertly, and no longer always appear as a property relationship in the old sense. But at its core, the same question remains: what happens when a person cannot leave a situation because violence, threats, debts, deception, dependence, or abuse of power hold him captive? Modern slavery manifests itself in many forms. People are forced to work without being able to quit freely. They are held in debt that they can never pay off. They are exploited in households, locked up in factories, cheated on construction sites, abused in agriculture, isolated on fishing boats, endangered in mines, or forced into sexual exploitation. Some are recruited by false promises. They are promised work, security, or a better life, but at their destination passports are taken away, wages are withheld, debts are invented, and threats are made. Others fall into the hands of exploiters through war, flight, poverty, or lack of legal protection. According to estimates by the ILO, Walk Free, and IOM, around 50 million people were living in modern slavery in 2021, of which about 28 million were in forced labor and 22 million in forced marriages. These figures show that unfreedom is not a closed chapter, but remains a reality of the present. What is particularly dangerous is that modern slavery often seems invisible. It does not always take place in chains, not always behind walls, and not always in distant countries. It can be hidden in supply chains, in cheap clothing, in food, in electronics, in construction projects, in home care, in meat processing, or in services that consumers hardly question in the end. This is exactly where a connection to the history of plantation farming becomes apparent. Back then, too, violence and consumption were separate. The sugar on European tables did not tell of the stick in Caribbean fields. The cotton in the factories did not tell of the hands they had picked under duress. Today, a cheap product can also contain a story that the buyer does not see. Modern exploitation often thrives on distance, concealment, and indifference. Human trafficking is one of the most brutal forms of modern bondage. It doesn't just mean that people are moved or sold. Exploitation through deception, coercion, threat, or abuse of a vulnerable situation is decisive. The UNODC report of 2024 describes that detected numbers of victims have risen again after the pandemic-related decline, and that children, forced labor, and forced crime in particular are coming into focus. Poverty, conflicts, and climate crises increase the vulnerability of many people because they can increase refugee movements, insecure work, and dependency. Forced labor is different from historical slavery, but it touches on the same moral core. Man is not treated as a free bearer of his own rights, but as a means to the gain of others. Debt bondage is a particularly old and at the same time modern example of this. A person borrows money or is allegedly charged costs for travel, accommodation, mediation, or work materials. Then it is claimed that it has to work off these debts. But wages are manipulated, interest rates are raised, deductions are invented, and freedom of movement is restricted. Guilt becomes a chain without visible iron. In some regions, This affects entire families over generations. Children grow into dependency because the plight of their parents already determines their future. This is frighteningly reminiscent of historical forms in which birth, origin, and economic power decided on freedom. Forced marriages are also one of the forms of modern slavery, when people are married against their will and cannot leave the union. This shows that lack of freedom arises not only in markets and workplaces, but also in the private and family sphere. Women and girls in particular are at risk when patriarchal structures, poverty, tradition, violence, and a lack of protection work together. But men and boys can also become victims of forced labor, exploitation, recruitment, or forced crime. Modern slavery has many faces, and it adapts to the weaknesses of a society. Where people cannot enforce rights, where authorities look the other way, where corruption prevails, or where economic pressure pushes every border, there is room for exploitation. However, the legacy of historical slavery is not only evident in modern forced labor. It is also reflected in racism, social inequality, land distribution, educational opportunities, wealth, political power, and a culture of remembrance. The descendants of enslaved people often began their freedom without land, without compensation, without security, and without equal access to education or political protection. The former owners, on the other hand, often retained property, influence, and social prestige. This inequality did not simply disappear with the next generation. It continued in discriminatory laws, violence, segregation, exclusion from credit, bad schools, unequal labor markets, and images that continued to devalue black people. So whoever talks about the end of slavery must also talk about what starting conditions were created or denied after liberation. Remembrance is therefore a political and moral struggle. For a long time, many societies told the story of slavery from the perspective of traders, colonial powers, plantation owners, or legislators. The voices of the enslaved were suppressed, trivialized, or treated only as footnotes. Museums, monuments, street names, and schoolbooks celebrated explorers, shipowners, merchants, or statesmen, without always showing the profits on which their power was based. Much has changed in recent decades, but not without conflict. The question of how to remember slavery touches on identity, responsibility, and national self-images. Some people fear that the past could burden their ancestors. Others insist that true reconciliation is not possible without truth. This is not about personally pronouncing people of the present for the deeds of past centuries. It is about taking responsibility for memory, consequences, and structures. A society cannot change what has happened, but it can decide whether to conceal it or name it. It can decide whether to make victims visible or glorify perpetrators. It can decide whether to consider historical gains as neutral prosperity or to ask who paid for them. It can decide whether education only tells of great empires, seafarers, and revolutions, or also of those whose work helped to build this world. Memory does not mean remaining trapped in the past. It means understanding the present more honestly. The demand for reparations is also part of this debate. It is complicated because the injustice of slavery has worked for centuries, continents, and many generations. But that is precisely why the question does not disappear. What do states, institutions, churches, companies, or universities owe to the descendants of those whose work has been stolen? Is an apology enough? Do we need educational programs, investments, restitution of cultural assets, compensation funds, institutional reforms, or symbolic recognition? There is no simple answer to this, but the question itself is justified. For historical violence continues to have an effect not only in memory, but often also in ownership, opportunities, and power relations. Modern societies are therefore faced with a double task. They must fight today's exploitation and at the same time understand the historical legacy. Against modern slavery, not only moral appeals help, but also concrete measures, strong labor rights, protection for migrants, control of supply chains, access to justice, protection of victims, fight against corruption, education, fair wages, and international cooperation. If you want to fight human trafficking, you also have to fight the conditions that make people vulnerable. Poverty, war, climate crises, missing papers, discrimination, and lack of legal protection are not marginal issues. They are the soil on which exploitation grows. At the same time, a different attitude towards history is needed. Slavery must not only be told as a dark exception that has been overcome with modernity. It was part of the emergence of modern worlds. It was linked to capital, trade, law, statehood, consumption, and ideology. It shows that progress and violence can coexist. A society can produce beautiful buildings, great ideas, technical innovations, and political freedom, and at the same time deprive other people of their rights. It is precisely this inconvenient truth that makes the history of slavery so important. She warns against measuring civilization only by its successes. One must also ask who was excluded, who had to pay, and whose humanity was denied. In the end, the history of slavery leads back to a simple but fundamental insight. Freedom cannot be taken for granted. It must be thought, protected, defended, and taken seriously for all people. Slavery began where people no longer saw other people as equals, but as possessions, tools, dangers, commodities, or inferior groups. It lives on in a modern form where people are robbed of their self-determination through coercion and exploitation. And their legacy remains noticeable where old inequalities are not dealt with. This last chapter is therefore not a final stroke, but a warning. The history of slavery tells of cruelty, profit, and power, but also of resistance, dignity, and the indestructible desire for freedom. It shows how low people can fall when they dehumanize others. But it also shows how strong people can stay, even if almost everything is taken from them. Those who know this history can see the present more clearly. Because the crucial question remains the same as at the beginning. Do we recognize the humanity of the other even when things get uncomfortable, expensive, or politically difficult? Only if the answer to this is an unequivocal yes has the lesson of this story really begun.